Chapter 238. AF1 wasn't hard to find, but it was hard to enter. Sillin had come to the preparatory campus. With their current identities, they wouldn't be able to enter the official campus. The preparatory campus was located in a different place from the official campus. In other words, they were on different planets. The preparatory campus wasn't far from the official campus. Sillin could see the planet where the official campus was located from this planet. The official campus of AF1 was located on a huge planet. There were 3 schools on the planet, AF1, AF2, and AF3. There were a few satellite planets around the planet. AF1's preparatory campus was located on one of these satellite planets. Of course, the central planet could be seen with the naked eye from the satellite planet. There were not many complicated tests required to enroll into AF3. However, AF1 and AF2 were different. AF1 was usually the leader of AF1, and the test would be held at the preparatory campus of AF1. The instructors from AF1 and AF2 would conduct a selection process together. After that, they would allocate the students based on the results of the selection process to determine who would be eliminated, who would be assigned to AF1, AF2, or AF3. The selection process for AF1's preparatory campus was carried out in stages. It was arranged according to the total number of recommendation cards sent out and the time. Sillin was in luck. The next stage of the selection process was not far away. There were specialized navigation robots in the capital, and all Sillin had to do was to find one at random. After entering the attached destination and his identity information, a specialized navigation robot came over and brought Sillin to a place where a specialized car was waiting for him. After Sillin showed his recommendation card, he was brought to this satellite planet. The navigation robot the size of a watermelon explained the arrangements to Sillin and brought Sillin to the entrance of the preparatory campus. It was also here that Sillin met Libero. Libero wasn't alone. There was a big guy with him. Libero called him Ironhead. Ironhead was also a mutant. Strictly speaking, Libero and Ironhead were considered half-mutants or mixed bloods. Of course, that was just a nice way of saying it. To put it bluntly, some nobles would call them bastards. Many nobles who thought highly of themselves looked down on them the most. They thought the existence of mixed bloods was a disgrace. Libero was shocked when he saw Sillin. He didn't expect Sillin to be here as well. However, after the initial shock, he was overjoyed. Libero was very happy to meet someone who didn't discriminate against mixed bloods like him. Previously, he thought that they were just passers-by and had no deep relationship with each other. But now, it was different. They were all comrades in the same trench. Libero introduced Ironhead to Sillin. When Ironhead saw that Sillin didn't show any disdain, he also showed a friendly smile. "Hey, Sillin, have you reported it yet?" Libero asked. "No." Sillin shook his head. They had stayed at the station for a long time. They had spent a lot of time eating with Huimao. It would be troublesome if this cat didn't have enough to eat. "We've already reported it. Let me take you there." Libero was very enthusiastic. They had just arrived, so they would be assigned temporary dormitories after reporting. If the 3 of them applied for a dormitory together, they would be put together. This was better than people they didn't know or people who discriminated against them. Reporting was very simple. They just needed to show their recommendation cards. Every recommendation card contained information about the person who recommended them. Sillin's carry card contained Griffin's information. Every tutor in AF1 and AF2 had to bear a certain amount of pressure when they gave out a recommendation card. This was because the recommended people might not necessarily be accepted. The final deduction ratio, which was the ratio of the number of recommendation cards given out to the number of people accepted, was closely related to the tutors. A tutor with a deduction ratio close to 1 would definitely be more respected in the affiliated schools. When Sillin handed the recommendation card to the person in charge, the person didn't pay much attention to it. After all, there were many tutors in the affiliated schools, and there would be many people who recommended them too. However, when the person in charge swiped the card and read the information, his attitude changed a little. He looked at Sillin curiously. He didn't expect Griffin to recommend someone who looked so ordinary. After getting the dormitory card, Sillin, Libero, and Ironhead went to the temporary dormitory area. Huimao came with them as a pet and didn't participate in the beast test. This was because he didn't have a recommendation. Even if he did, Huimao wouldn't participate in the test. The temporary dormitory was similar to the dormitory that Silin saw in Baron Bader. However, it was a 5-person dormitory. Everyone had their own bedroom, but they shared the training room and living room. When Silin and the other 2 arrived at their assigned dormitory, there was already a person living there. From the looks of it, this person had been here for a while. When Silin and the others came in, the person seemed to have just woken up. He was still a little sleepy. When he saw Silin and the others, he stretched. "Yo, your roommates are here? All 3 of you are?" Libero first introduced himself, then introduced Silin and Ironhead. The person scratched his messy hair and chuckled. "I'm Wally. I come from a small corner of a planet in the 17th star sector." As he spoke, Wally sniffed. "You guys bought breakfast? It's lunch now, right?" Libero said helplessly. Wally rubbed his hands. "Whatever. Can I join?" "Sure. We bought enough anyway." Silin put the things on the big table in the living room. Huimao squatted in front of his plate and cut Wally's spoon into 3 pieces when it reached over. However, Wally liked to tease Huimao. When a spoon broke, he would change to a fork. Finally, he succeeded in stabbing a small fish out of Huimao's plate. Huimao was so angry that he jumped up and scratched Wally's face. However, Wally seemed to be quite open-minded. When he talked about his trip to AF1's preparatory campus, he summed it up in one word: debt collection. The place where Wally lived had nothing to do with the people of Fu High School. It was even more remote than Old Chang's planet. However, one day, Wally ran into a person who had forcefully landed his spaceship near his house. He was in a good mood, so he gave the person a meal. Then, the 2 of them got into a fight. Wally was beaten black and blue, and no one in the entire street could recognize him. Then, the person kicked Wally twice, took all the food in his house, and left. Before he left behind a card and some money, telling Wally to find him at Fu High School, and that he would make sure Wally didn't have to worry about food or clothing. After that, Wally came. Listening to Wally's story, Silin felt that the teachers of the affiliated schools were quite unique. They were all unpredictable. Wally was not a mixed blood like Libero and Ironhead. Like Silin, he was a normal person. However, someone who could get a recommendation card from an affiliated school's teacher had to have something special about him, even if the teacher's methods were a little strange. Tai Tu's parents were servants of a noble family. Because they saw that Tai Tu had some ability, they used their connections to get a recommendation card and recommended him. But if Tai Tu were to be eliminated, it was easy to imagine that their family would have a hard time in the future. That was why Ironhead was under a lot of pressure. Libero, on the other hand, was only able to get a recommendation card because of his teacher's connections. However, Libero did not want to talk about the details. Anyone could see that things were not as simple as he made them out to be. There had to be more to it, but since Libero was unwilling to talk about it, Silin and the others did not ask anymore. The last one was the most special. He was an 8-year-old child of noble birth, but he was more lively than most nobles. He didn't pretend to be arrogant, indifferent, and sarcastic like some other nobles. Although he called them, "this young master," every time he opened his mouth, it was obvious from his eyes that he didn't mean to belittle Celine and the others at all. It was more like a colloquialism, just a habit. The one who brought the child here was an old servant. The old servant reminded Silin of Berzette, who was always by Lung's side. Although he was polite and always had a smile on his face, he was not to be underestimated. According to the rules of AF1, servants were not allowed to be brought here. Therefore, the old servant only brought the child here and placed a lot of things in the room. The storage cabinets in the living room and the kitchen were filled with things. The old servant said that these were greeting gifts for everyone. He hoped that Silin and the others could help his young master. This was the young master's first time away from home. Silin and the others promised that they would take care of him. After all, they were all roommates in the same dorm. Silin believed that the old servant must have investigated all 4 of them before coming here. Otherwise, he would not have brought the young master here so easily. The child's name was Taida, but his surname was not mentioned. The old servant finally left after the child impatiently called him back. After the old servant left, Taida jumped up and down in the bedroom that the old servant had tidied up and cheered loudly as if he had been liberated. Sillin and the others looked at each other. As expected, it was a child. Taida did not put on airs. Even though he spoke with the accent that nobles always had, his actions left people speechless. For example, Taida would say, "Hey, you guys, come over and talk to this young master." But in reality, Taida would run over to Sillin and the others and join in the conversation. Although he was young, he knew a lot. "Hey, young Master Taida, do you know how the selection test will be conducted this time?" Wally asked as he lay on a chair and cracked some nuts. Sillin did not like nuts very much, but Hui Mao did. Therefore, while they were chatting, Sillin would shell Hui Mao and give some to Taida. Taida ate the nuts that Sillin had peeled as he stretched out his palm and spread his fingers. AF1's test has always had 5 rounds. It's called AF1's fifth test. AF1's fifth test? Is it difficult? Libero asked. Taida chewed on the nuts and frowned. "I heard it's quite difficult. In the first round, you have to use a pen to write on paper." "Right. You mean, you have to use a pen to write word by word on that kind of paper?" Ironhead was troubled. Even as a servant, he had never used paper to write. He had always used an electronic tablet. If he really used a pen to write, he probably would not be able to read what he wrote. Libero and Ironhead were in the same situation, but Sillin and Wally were much calmer. They were more familiar with this kind of thing. Sillin handed a peeled nut to the child. "Continue." Taida took the nut and threw it into his mouth, crunching noises as he chewed on it. His teeth were quite good. Then he started counting with his fingers. After that, there's the stress test, the 3 tests, the cooperation test, and the final interview. But don't worry, there's no so-called passing standard for each round. I don't know what they're selecting based on. Some obviously did badly in the written test, but were accepted in the end. Some who did well were rejected in the end. Taida told them everything he knew, but the more Sillin and the others learned, the more they felt that AF1 selection test was so different. Chapter 239. It was their first day here, and they hadn't calmed down yet, so they chatted a little late that night. In order to take care of Taida, the youngest of the hostel, Sillin and the others helped him a lot. It was obvious at first glance that the child lived like a prince. Even when he was bathing, there was a robot to scrub his back, and the old servant had arranged everything for him. Sillin and the others had seen Taida's room before. After the old servant had finished decorating the room, they had all taken a look. It was so complete that Taida didn't have to do many things himself. He only had to give orders to the housekeeping robots and the AI system. As soon as he saw the thick plush carpet in Taida's room, Hui Mao felt an itch on his back. He wanted to rub against it immediately. In fact, Hui Mao did that, but Sillin twisted him back before he went to sleep. There are a few hidden surveillance cameras in this dorm. There are 3 in Taida's room, 1 in the kitchen, 1 in the bathroom, and 2 in the living room. Hui Mao said unhappily next to Sillin after he was twisted back into his room. The final conclusion was that other than Sillin's and the other 3's rooms, the rest of the dorm was monitored. Looks like Taida has a pretty deep background. Sillin scratched Hui Mao's chin. He thought about what Taida had said about the 5th exam in AF5 and closed his eyes to sleep. Before he could fall asleep, Sillin was woken up by Hui Mao's slap. What? Sillin didn't even open his eyes. That kid can't sleep. He's probably homesick because he's not used to it. Through the surveillance in Taida's room, Hui Mao knew what was going on in the room. Since we're here, we have to get through it. 10 minutes later. The cat's paw slapped Sillin's back. What's wrong with you? Sillin still didn't open his eyes. That kid looks like he's been wronged. Do you have the heart to do that? People always learn to be strong while they cry. It's a way of growing up. Hui Mao flicked his ears. No one knew if he understood. Another 10 minutes passed. Sillin suddenly turned over and opened his eyes. In front of him, Hui Mao raised his claws and was about to slap down again. I really admire you. At the same time, on another planet in the Imperial capital, in a room in a vast castle-like building complex, a few people were staring at the situation in Taida's room displayed on a large screen. Seeing the 8-year-old child rolling around on the bed, unable to fall asleep, the two women wiped their tears with handkerchiefs. "I told you not to send him in so early. Look, the child can't even sleep when he's away from home." "That's right, Dad. Taida is still young, and you know what kind of place AF1 is. Besides, Taida doesn't need to walk the same path as us. He'll be fine with us protecting him." "I agree. Let's bring Taida back," another man in military uniform said. The people around them all looked at the man standing in the middle, who was almost old but still looked handsome and extraordinary. The beautiful woman standing on the side wiped her tears and glanced at her father, who was standing straight in the middle. She thought to herself, "Keep pretending. The old man is the one who loves Taida the most." I don't know what he heard from some people in the army this time, but he was so emotional that he sent Taida over. He regrets it more than anyone else, but he didn't say it out because he wanted to save face. Hearing the words of the people around him, the old man sighed inwardly in relief. It's better to bring him back. He's too young. Those people can say whatever they want. It's not like he'll lose a piece of flesh. When Taida grows up in 2 years, he'll send him over. I'm sure Taida won't disappoint him. The child is still too young. Too young. My heart aches for him. The old man was about to speak when the doorbell to Taida's room rang. Taida immediately sat up and rearranged his facial expression so that he didn't look as depressed and helpless as before. This made the people staring at the screen feel sad again. Taida opened the door. Before he could say anything, something was thrown at him. He quickly caught it and saw that it was Hui Mao. Silin yawned and said to Taida, "It's for your bed. This cat likes your carpet, so let him sleep here. Of course, if you don't want to, you can just throw him out." After that, Silin went back to his room and went back to sleep. Taida blinked at the door and looked at Hui Mao in his arms, before he closed the door and went back inside. As soon as he returned to Taida's room, Hui Mao couldn't wait to jump onto the carpet and start rubbing against it. When it looked up and saw that Taida was staring at it without blinking, Hui Mao got up and shook its fur. "Don't worry about me. Go to sleep. I'll guard the door for you." After that, Hui Mao went back to rubbing its fur on the carpet. After Hui Mao's antics, Taida was in a much better mood. After watching for a while, he picked up the soft cushion from the bed and sat down next to Hui Mao. The temperature in the bedroom was very suitable, and it was intelligently controlled, so there was no need to worry about catching a cold at all. Half an hour later, the man and the cat fell asleep on the carpet. The people in front of the big screen didn't say anything for a long time. In the end, the old man didn't take Taida back. He wanted to see Taida's test results first. The test of AF1 finally arrived under the anticipation of more than 1,000 people. All of them had recommendation cards, but they received them at different times. When the number of people reached the required number, AF1 would start the countdown for the test. The first of the 5 tests of AF1 was the written test that Taida had mentioned. In the previous stage, the written test only had 1 test paper, and the time limit was 3 hours. There weren't many questions, but they were very difficult. But this time was obviously different. The written test this time was 10 hours long. There were no breaks in the middle, and people had to bring their own food. So, apart from going to the toilet, the rest of the time was spent in the examination room. None of the candidates knew where their seats would be. Everyone gathered in the venue and sat down casually. Then, a barrier rose around the chairs to cover everyone, and they were moved to the examination room. Inside the examination room, you could only see the white light barrier around you. You couldn't see what was on the other side of the barrier. However, people standing outside the examination room could see everything clearly. So, don't try anything funny, or you'd end up in a very bad situation if you were caught. When everyone was moved to the examination room, they found that they were facing a thick book of test papers. That's right, it was a book. This included basic personal information as well as various aspects of the test and so on. Silin looked at it. The front was all basic information, including personal hobbies, what books you read, what information you read, what news you followed online, living habits, and so on. Many people tried to write positive things, but they didn't know that during the test, the tutors would arrange the test questions according to the information you wrote. If they found out that you lied, the tutors would make things very difficult for you. Silin didn't write too much. He only wrote down shooting and so on. After all, Guanfeng's gun was there, so it was only a matter of time before he wrote it down. These basic personal information also showed how much a person knew about themselves. It was also possible to tell whether a person was arrogant or had low self-esteem from the information they filled in. However, Silin didn't know what the written test standards were. Taida had said that some people were admitted even though they couldn't write. However, when Silin wrote the first word, Silin understood a little why there was a book of test papers. A person's handwriting would reflect some of that person's circumstances. A person's handwriting was like a person's. Their handwriting would become vigorous and steady as they grew older or more experienced. It was different at different times. If a person was in a good mood, their handwriting would be neat and tidy. If a person was in a bad mood, their handwriting would be crooked and crooked. The pressure of writing, the structure of the strokes, the size of the word, and even the level of the stroke could reflect a lot of things. For example, a person's habitual strength, self-awareness, the coordination between thinking and behavior, and so on. The speed of writing was also related to a person's comprehension. The layout of the words could also reflect the writer's attitude towards the outside world. Of course, there was also the issue of mentality. If a person's mentality changed, their handwriting would change along with it. There were definitely a lot of people whose handwriting became more and more sloppy as they went on, but there were also people whose handwriting didn't change much from beginning to end. That was the difference. After Silin was done filling in the basic information, he flipped to the opening questions. This was Silin's habit. Back at Seven Lights, he would select all the questions and go through them once before he started working on them, even if he didn't need to write with a pen. The first question, noun explanation. It was a familiar question, but Silin couldn't help but feel lost as he stared at 5 whole pages of noun explanation. 99% of the questions were unfamiliar terms, and Silin hadn't heard of them since he came to the Mist Bodhisattva Empire. He continued to flip to the back. Questions and answers, calculations, discussions. I'm sorry, but there were no multiple-choice questions or true or false questions here. If you don't know, then you don't know. It wasn't like you could make a blind guess. Just as Taida had said, the questions covered a wide range of topics, ranging from the formation of the universe, quantum mechanics, evolutionary history, molecular formula, human reproduction, positive and abnormal physiological indicators, and ancient questions like which came first, the chicken or the egg. When he flipped to the 5th last question on the 3rd to last page, Silin raised an eyebrow. There was only a short, inconspicuous line of words there. Choose 30 of the questions above. No bonus points for writing more than that. Most of the time, such words would appear at the beginning of a test paper or at the end of a test paper. But it was very novel, and it was the 5th last question on the 3rd to last page of this test paper. It wasn't easy to notice at all. There was no telling how many people would be shocked by this sentence in the end. Silin shook his head and continued to look at the questions at the back. The questions at the back were pretty much the same, except for the last one. After confirming that there were no other hidden meanings, Silin began to write. 2 hours later, Silin finished the first 30 questions and the questions at the back. All that was left was the last question. The last question's title was this: if you feel that the above questions aren't enough to showcase your characteristics or abilities, please feel free to answer them here. After thinking about it, Silin drew a cat in the answer area of this question on a whim. It was a chubby cat with a fish biscuit in its mouth. After answering the question, Silin was not in a hurry to hand in his test paper. After checking it once, he laid on the table and began to catch up on his sleep. He felt that the later tests of AF1 would be very exhausting, so he needed to accumulate energy in advance. There were some instructors from AF1 and AF2 walking around the examination room. They could clearly see the petty tricks of the examinees. Some gave warnings, some had their marks deducted, but none of them were disqualified on the spot. There were also a few examinees like Silin who finished their papers early. They either handed in their papers early or slept on the table like Silin, so Sillin did not stand out among them. However, the examinees who finished their questions within 3 hours were recorded by the chief examiner. Sillin was woken up by the bell that rang the end of the test. After leaving the examination room, he met up with Libero and the others at the agreed place. Judging from Libero and Ironhead's expressions, they probably did not see the sentence on the third last page. Now, the two of them were still depressed. Wally was still as carefree as ever. Although Taida did not see the sentence, he was in a good mood. If he passed the test, so be it. After all, he did not feel too much pressure. The examinees who finished the first round of the written test did not have much time to rest. The space plane sent them to another place for the next round of tests. The stress test was to check the examinees' physical reactions to stress, such as recovery ability, immune tolerance, and physiological reactions under conditions such as low oxygen and low pressure. The examinees' physical limits and physiological defects were also checked. The results of the test were divided into 5 grades from highest to lowest, S, A, B, C, and D. However, the examinees did not know the final results of the test. Under such stress, mutants would reveal another side of themselves, revealing the other half of their bloodline. However, this information was kept confidential. The examinees did not know about anyone other than the instructors in charge. Sillin underwent a basic drug allergy test, wound healing test, low oxygen and low pressure test, and a series of other tests. After Sillin left, the examiner wrote an S on Sillin's final grade. What happened next was just as Sillin had predicted. The examinees were not given much time to rest at all. After the second round of tests was over, the examinees were sent to another part of the planet for the third round of tests. This time, however, Sillin noticed that the number of examinees was a little less. Although it was not a lot, there were still more than 50 examinees missing. The third round of tests was also known as the 3 tests. The examinees would choose 3 of the tests they wanted to take. Sillin chose shooting, close combat, and assembly. The reason why he chose these 3 wasn't because Sillin was the most confident in them, but because everyone else knew about them. At the very least, Guan Feng definitely knew about them. Needless to say, the assembly was over very quickly. The examiners in charge of assembly had even studied the parts Sillin had assembled and written a very long comment on Sillin's test results. As for what they wrote, Sillin did not know. In close combat, Sillin's opponent was a big blockhead who looked like an iron head. This person was an expert in strength, and he was able to punch a hole in the reinforced ground with a single punch. Not only that, he was completely fine as he continued his next punch. At first, Sillin chose to defend and not attack. It was only after he had a general understanding of the big guy's strength and allowed him to display enough of his abilities that he ended the battle in one blow. The last test was shooting. There were a lot of people who chose shooting, and Sillin had to line up to come here. Unlike the previous tests, shooting was half open to the public. The examinees who chose to shoot could see everyone else's performance in the shooting field. There were a lot of excellent shooters, and every examinee displayed their best skills. However, there was a phenomenon in the shooting field that the examinees cheered a lot, but the instructors in charge did not react much. Chapter 240. Everyone knew that the affiliated schools had no shortage of geniuses. AF1 and AF2 had already gathered geniuses from all walks of life in the Empire. Perhaps the teachers were already numb to it. After all, there were too many geniuses here, and it was tiring to judge them. The shooting test field was circular, and within the circular area were 8 small fields. Each field occupied a 45-degree fan-shaped area. Outside the shooting field, there was a ring of stands. The stands were divided into 2 levels. The upper level was where the teachers in charge of the test moved around, while the lower level was where the students who came to take the test could move around. Those who had already completed the test or were waiting to take the test could all watch the people who were taking the test in the shooting field below. Shooting was a compulsory course for every student. Even if you had never touched a gun before, you would still have to take shooting lessons after you were officially admitted. Therefore, shooting was considered a key course in the school, and many teachers liked to use it to test the students. Regardless of whether it was the course assessment or the selection test, shooting accounted for a higher percentage of the students. Because of this, a lot of people chose to shoot. Perhaps in the outside world, curve shooting would be an extremely difficult technique, but here, when geniuses collided with geniuses, it was no longer a problem. If you shot 100% of the time, the teachers might take a second look at you. Some of the previous batches of AF1 and AF2 students were also watching from the sidelines. From their expressions, Sillin could tell that not many of the people who came to take the exam were worthy of their attention. Of course, it was not that the people taking the test were too weak. If they had been admitted and trained by the affiliated schools, they would have shone even brighter. As the teachers watched indifferently, and as the students from previous batches chatted and laughed, the candidates entered and left one after another. Before coming here, they were full of ambition, but after experiencing it for themselves, they finally understood why AF1 and AF2 could become the top schools in the empire. Gold would always shine, but when there was a lot of gold together, your gold would not stand out. However, in Sillin's opinion, the shooting test tested the shooting skills of the candidates, and the other was to observe the type of gun each candidate was used with. Yes, the guns used in the shooting test were chosen by the candidates themselves, and the settings allowed them to use their own guns. This was why guns were not prohibited when coming to AF1's preparatory campus. It also showed that the people of AF1 had the ability to control any possible situation. Sillin looked up at the sky and watched the people shooting below. Libero and Ironhead did not choose to shoot, but Wally and Taida did. Wally was in front of Sillin, and Taida was behind Sillin. They were arranged according to the order of registration. Wally and Sillin were assigned to the same sector. Wally's gun sense was very good, and when Sillin watched Wally shoot, he thought of Tang Chiochio. This kind of gun sense was either innate, or it was the influence of his living environment. If it was the latter, then Wally lived in a messy place, but it wasn't easy to nurture a carefree person like Wally in such a messy place. Wally directly chose a gun from the gun rack in the shooting range. After looking at it, he fired one round before starting. Then he hit all the targets, and it was a series of shots. Standing here, Sillin couldn't see Wally's eyes when he shot. He could only see his shooting technique and the result. Maybe some of the instructors could see it through the cameras inside the shooting range. Sillin could not see the look in Wally's eyes when he was shooting. He could only see the shooting method and the result. Perhaps some of the teachers could see it through the cameras in the shooting field. Sillin, it's almost your turn, right? Taida ran over. He had just gone to chat with a student from the previous batch. Taida did not feel any pressure when it came to designing the test. Yes, there are 2 more people. Celine pointed at the fan-shaped area in front of them and said. Taida waved his hand. Don't be nervous, calm down. This was what his father often told him. Sillin smiled. I'm not nervous. As they spoke, Wally came back from his stroll. There's nothing much to see. It's rare for the people from the previous batches to be looking at the pretty girls. The girls are looking at the pretty boys, and the teachers are yawning. I don't know if they're trying to piss us off. Wally leaned on the fence like he had no bones. I'm so hungry. Do you guys have anything to eat? Sillin tossed a hardtack, a bag of jerky, and a bottle of water to Wally. Conserve your energy. I think the next round will be quite tight. This test is so troublesome. Wally took the food and started to replenish his energy. Wally didn't have a subspace container, and those were luxuries for him. That was why he couldn't carry a lot of food like Sillin and Taida, and he didn't want to eat nutrient pills either. They were fine for normal times, but they couldn't satisfy his energy requirements at all during a test like this. Oh, I asked around. Apparently, there are some changes to the 3rd round, Taida said. What changes? Sillin and Wally looked at Taida at the same time. Taida sighed. I heard that from now on, the 3rd round will be a 3+1 test. There will be 3 optional tests, plus another test. However, this extra test might be different every batch. I think we're going to test long-distance running this time. Long-distance running? How long is it? Sillin asked. Taida shook his head. I don't know. They don't know either. We'll have to ask the teachers in charge. Wally looked up at the sky while eating the jerky. His face was bright and sad. I have a bad feeling. Cillian's number tag vibrated. It was a test reminder. I'm going now. You guys talk. After saying this, Cillian walked toward the fan-shaped area of the shooting range. He took out the box Guanfeng had given him. Subspace was not allowed inside the shooting range. Since Guanfeng had given this to Cillian, it meant that he wanted Cillian to use it boldly. There was no need to hide it. After the first examinee came out, Cillian inserted the number tag he had received earlier into the slot. The door opened, and Cillian walked in with the box. What's that box? Wally asked Taita while eating a compressed biscuit. A gun, I think? Taita wasn't sure himself. Very few people carried a gun in a box. There were about 50 or so light markers flashing in the target area. Each light marker was only the size of a fingernail, and their speed and direction were unpredictable. Cillian stood still in the shooting range. He opened the box on a nearby table and began assembling it. His speed wasn't any slower than Guanfeng's. The instructor who was looking at his area abruptly rose to his feet. Feeling uncertain, he pulled up the monitor and took a closer look. He couldn't help but curse, "Fuck. There's no way that old Fox Guan would do that. There's no way he would." Another instructor saw the man's reaction and swayed over with a teacup. "What's wrong? Is your sciatic nerve convulsing?" "Convulse my ass. I asked old Fox Guan for it so many times, but he wouldn't give it to me. He just had to give it to a little kid." The instructor almost dropped his cup when he saw the image on the monitor. "I can't believe he gave it away so quickly." The other instructors were curious about the duo's reaction as well. They all wore different expressions after learning the reason, but it had to be said that the box had attracted all of the instructors' attention. Why does Cillian's gun look so strange?" Wally mumbled while stuffing his mouth. "A purgatory thunder snake. That's a purgatory thunder snake. The pattern on the lid is the symbol of a purgatory thunder snake, and it's a K-type gun." "It's a K-type?" Taita yelled excitedly as he stared at Cillian's situation without blinking. Taita had only seen the B-type and E-type purgatory thunder snakes. He had never seen a K-type before. His father said that there were no more than 5 people in the entire empire who used a K-type gun. AF1 had always wanted to train people to use a K-type gun, but very few of them passed. According to his father, the old Fox Guan was very difficult to deal with. Even those who thought they could use a K-type gun were rejected by the old Fox Guan. Taita's yell attracted a lot of attention. Some of the people who were talking also looked over. Even those who didn't know about the Purgatory Thunder snake saw Taita's reaction. Combined with the gazes of the instructors on the second floor, they also began to pay attention to Cillian's situation. The reactions of this year's candidates were obviously not as big as those of the previous years. When they found out that Cillian was using a Purgatory Thunder snake K-type gun, they all looked like they had seen a ghost. Then they all stared at Cillian's shooting range. After Cillian finished assembling the gun, the system would give a 10-second explanation, telling the candidates how much time they had to shoot and other nonsense. However, the purpose of this nonsense was actually to let the candidates adjust themselves to their best state within these 10 seconds. That was because the moment the candidates entered the shooting range, the candidates' various physiological parameters had already begun to be tested. Their heart rate, pulse, blood pressure, and other data had begun to be traced. This was also a good way to test each candidate's mental strength. When the 10 seconds were up, the system announced the start of the shooting range. Cillian raised his gun and fired without any hesitation. Missed. Before Wally could finish his sentence, he heard the system on Cillian's side report 5 times in a row. Target hit. And then, there was no then. Cillian put the gun away, dismantled and reassembled it, and left. The shooting range was silent. Only the sounds of the other fan-shaped systems could be heard. Combined with that, the entire place was in an uproar. The biscuit crumbs in Wally's mouth sprayed out. He almost choked to death and only recovered after gulping down a few mouthfuls of water. Five shots. Wally stretched out his palm towards Taita and spread his fingers, as if to confirm the number. 5 shots. Taita's eyes lit up. This was the K-gun. the highest level of the Purgatory Thunder Snake, the K-gun. His father had always hoped to poach someone who used a K-gun, but the old fox at the gate never let them go. Taida had often heard his father complain, but after seeing Silin's shooting today, Taida finally understood why his father had always been so insistent on poaching someone who used a K-gun. Although his abilities were limited and he couldn't really understand it, 5 shots and 50 hits was enough. The instructor in charge of Silin's fan-shaped area looked at the physiological parameters of the shooter drawn by the system. After a while, he sighed. Another one. Another person who shot like he was eating, with no fluctuations in his parameters. Before Silin, Wally had also been like this. Silin. Silin. Taida walked over and looked at Silin eagerly. Can I touch K? K was Taida's nickname for the Purgatory Thunder Snake K-gun. He always called it that in private. It depends on your performance. If you do well in the test later, I'll agree. It's a deal. It's a deal. Okay. Just you wait. With that, Taida ran towards the shooting range. It was almost his turn, but he wasn't in the fan-shaped area. He was on the other side. Wally looked at Silin with a strange expression. Hey, what snake is that? How did you shoot it? I want to see it too. I'll show you when we get back. Hee, thanks. Wally chewed on his biscuit and continued watching the test, but his mind was already wandering. Taida wasn't old, but his marksmanship wasn't bad. He didn't have any fancy techniques, curve shots, or multiple shots, but every shot hit the center of the light, and he was very decisive. After the test, Taida ran back impatiently. How was it? Not bad, right? Not bad. I'll show you when we get back after the test. Now, hurry up and rest. The shooting is almost over, and the additional test is about to be revealed, Silin said. Just as Silin said, after the shooting was over, the other tests were also over. The students were sent to a gathering point. At the gathering point, Silin's group met up with Libero and Ironhead. Looking at their expressions, it was obvious that they'd done well. But while the 3 tests were not bad, the following additional test made everyone speechless. The additional test was a long-distance run. Many people had heard about this, but they only knew the specifics now. What was the specifics? Run around the ball. What did running around the ball mean? Look, everyone was standing on the equator. This was also the name of a track that AF1 had specially built. The equator wasn't as flat and narrow as the other tracks. It was wide and full of obstacles. Trees, stone piles, slopes, and so on. Even though Planet Hiku wasn't big, running around the ball was enough for everyone. Apart from the geographical obstacles, everyone looked at the black guy running over and suddenly felt as if autumn frost had swept past them. Is that a monkey? No, that's a chimpanzee, a giant chimpanzee. It's really huge. As the chimpanzee ran closer and closer, the tremors on the ground grew stronger. My stomach is starting to tremble, Wally said. That's a kidney you're touching. I'm shaking all over. No one taught me how to fight against this species in my entire life. Wally pointed at the big guy that was about 10 meters tall. There's more. Silin pointed at some animals that were running over from the other side. In other words, not only did they have to run around the ball, but they also couldn't run slowly and defenselessly. There would be these big guys chasing after them. I hate 3+1. Wally looked up at the sky and sighed. Celine looked left and right, and suddenly realized that the cat had run off somewhere to contact its feelings. Chapter 241. The additional test didn't have a time limit, and they couldn't use flying tools. Of course, it was a different story if they were like Zani who could fly. There weren't too many rules to avoid them. They could form groups or teams. Therefore, the 5 people in Celine's dormitory moved together. From the start, Silin noticed that Taida's expression was a little strange. Compared to Libero and Ironhead, who were full of distress, Taida looked more like he was happy to see an old friend. He just tried his best to maintain a serious expression. Although Taida wasn't big, his stamina was quite good. At least he didn't fall behind. In order to avoid the animals behind them, there would probably be some animals that would cause trouble on the road ahead. Sillin and the others saw an unlucky guy being thrown backwards by a black gorilla by the leg. The tigers, leopards, bulls and snakes wouldn't be too bad either. After running for a while, Sillin's group of 5 rested behind a pile of rocks. They would continue after an hour. Taida, I didn't know you had such good stamina, Libero said. Of course, I've been training with my dad's subordinates since I was young. Taida was quite proud of this. Sillin looked at the sky. Their pace couldn't keep up with the speed of the planet's rotation. They couldn't experience day all the time. However, they didn't know what would happen when night fell. They couldn't reason with the animals. If they didn't grasp the situation, they would probably be in trouble, just like that poor guy who had been sent flying by the black gorilla. If Sillin was alone, it would definitely be much faster. With Sillin's ability to hide, it would be much better than the 5 of them moving together. However, this was just an additional test. There was no need to fight for first place. They could move together and help those guys. They could also learn some other information along the way. At first, Sillin was thinking of sending the gray cat to make friends with the animals, but who would have thought that the gray cat would disappear without a trace before the preliminaries even began? It only left behind the words, "I'm going to make friends," before disappearing completely. "It's dark," Wally said as he leaned against the pile of rocks and watched the darkening sky. His tone was a little embarrassed. He didn't seem like his usual carefree self. "Are you afraid of the dark?" Taida asked. "I'm not afraid. I'm just worried." "Don't worry, we're here. If you want to sleep, then go ahead. Use this time to take a nap. We'll continue our journey later." Libero moved to the outside and had Wally stay in the middle. "You guys stay here first, I'll check out the terrain." They didn't know anything about this special runway, and they weren't allowed to bring any detectors. There were signal shielding devices and magnetic field disruptors around it. Those with a poor sense of direction would probably go the wrong way. Sillin quietly checked the surroundings of the pile of rocks, then climbed up a pile of rocks and hid himself in the shadows to observe the situation around the pile of rocks. Looking at the placement of the stones from above, Sillin gradually figured out some principles. The locations of these piles of rocks would affect people's thinking and confuse them into making the wrong choice. He felt that there was something fishy about this place. In this short amount of time, Sillin discovered that the positions of the piles of rocks had changed. When they entered the area of the pile of rocks, they had marked the route, but if they continued to follow these markings, they would definitely go the wrong way. After going the wrong way, they would return, and then go the wrong way again. In the end, they would be trapped here until dawn, but no one knew what would happen during the long night. It was better to leave this place early and find another resting spot. While Sillin was looking at the arrangement of the pile of rocks, a figure quietly snuck into the area of the pile of rocks. After a short pause, the figure floated over to Sillin and approached from behind Sillin. On the other side, Wally, who had been resting with his eyes closed, suddenly opened his eyes and looked in Sillin's direction. But before he could say anything, there was a thud, as if something heavy had fallen to the ground. Wally quickly got up and ran in that direction, with Libero and the other 2 following closely behind. But when the 4 of them arrived at the pile of rocks where Sillin was, they discovered that Sillin was standing on top of the pile of rocks, safe and sound, and there was a person lying on the ground that they did not recognize. This was definitely not a candidate who had participated in the test. Sillin had an impression of all the candidates who had participated in the test, but Sillin was sure that he had never seen this person before. In other words, this person was a student from the previous batch. In the long-distance race of the additional test, other than the animals causing trouble for the candidates, there were also students from the previous batches watching. They were there to ferret out the candidates who did not follow the rules and used illegal tools. At the same time, like the animals, they would occasionally create some obstacles for the candidates. Wally walked over and pulled on the person, saying, "He fainted. He tried to sneak up on me, so I knocked him out." Sillin got down from the pile of rocks and looked around. "Let's hurry up and leave. There's something strange about this pile of rocks. The longer we delay, the more it will affect our judgment." The few of them nodded, but before they could take a step, they felt the ground shake. "It's that chimpanzee. Hurry up and leave," Libero said. "No, we can't leave for now. Sillin pointed in the direction in front of them. There are people coming from that direction. The few of them quickly left and hid, erasing all traces of what had happened. However, the person who had been knocked out by Sillin was left there. 3 people flew over from the sky. One was a mutant with wings, while the other 2 were normal humans. However, they were wearing flight suits and had miniature propellers on their feet. The 3 of them headed straight for where the person who had been knocked out was lying. When the 3 of them saw the person on the ground, they checked his condition and injected him with a medicine. The person quickly woke up. Seeing that his companion had finally woken up, one of them laughed gloatingly. Careless, huh? Let me tell you, be careful. Even if they haven't received training from the affiliated schools, there are still many powerful people. The person who had woken up sat up and rubbed his neck. He cursed. Fuck, that kid moved too fast. I miscalculated. They should still be in this pile of rocks. It won't be easy to find them in there. The instruments are all jammed, and we can't detect them. We'll have to find them ourselves. No, we just need to trap them here. An hour is enough. By then, the children will probably be confused by the rocks. The few of them jumped onto the pile of rocks and stood on top of it, chatting while paying attention to their surroundings. As they were talking, the chimpanzee was getting closer. Hey, King Kong, I heard you threw a poor kid away? Did you break his leg or his arm? One of them joked. The chimpanzee bared his teeth and walked over, pounding his chest and roaring. He raised his chin and ignored the 4 of them, continuing to walk forward. Hey, this guy is getting more and more arrogant. But then again, King Kong doesn't seem to have lost his way here. There's a phrase in this world called the intuition of a beast. The quartet on top of the pile of rocks were conversing in a relaxed manner, but Libero and the others who were hiding in the shadows were feeling bitter inside. Sillin observed for a moment and discovered that the chimpanzee was walking past them, but the quartet was still around, and it wasn't a good idea to switch places right now. They would be discovered if they weren't careful. Libero and Ironhead both had bitter expressions. Wally's eyes were lowered, and it was hard to tell what he was feeling. However, he was on high alert. Sillin glanced at Taida, and the little guy was grinning at the chimpanzee. Seeing Sillin looking at him, Taida raised his head and made a shoo gesture at Sillin, then continued to look in King Kong's direction. The chimpanzee was getting closer and closer. Libero's palms were sweating. If they were exposed, they wouldn't just have to face this black guy, but also the 4 past students. He really wanted to remind Taida not to look in that direction, but before he could touch Taida, he was so shocked by Taida's action that his hair almost stood on end. Taida looked around and made sure that the 4 past students couldn't see him from this angle. Then, when the chimpanzee walked over, he stuck his head out and put a finger in front of his mouth. Shoo, Sillin and the others, Libero, Ironhead, and Wally stiffened. Then, their muscles tightened, and they were ready to rush out at any time. The next moment, they saw Sillin and Taida both jump toward the chimpanzee. The 4 of them who were chatting on top of a pile of rocks looked in the direction of the chimpanzee, frowned, and thought for a moment. Then, he shook his head and continued the conversation with his companions. The chimpanzee walked further and further away until it left the area of rocks. Hey, is this considered going through the back door? Libero asked in a low voice. Now, all 5 of them were lying on the chimpanzee's belly, and the chimpanzee's back was facing the 4 of them. Perhaps the 4 of them didn't expect this to happen. Yeah. Wally looked at the tuft of fur in his hand. It was really tough. He really wished he could take a tuft of it back as a souvenir. The chimpanzee only stopped when it could no longer see the area of rocks. Thank you, King Kong. Taida landed on the ground and patted the chimpanzee's arm. Hee hee, you're welcome. A crisp baby voice rang out. Let me introduce you guys. This is King Kong. We've known each other since we were young. Every year he comes to my house to play, Taida introduced. Now, Libero and the others finally understood why Taida wasn't worried at all, and Sillin didn't react at all. It turned out that he was Taida's old friend. It wasn't surprising that many beasts in the affiliated schools knew how to talk. But why did he have a baby voice? Taida, he's still a child? No, is he still in his infancy? Wally looked at the big guy curiously. Yes, King Kong is still a child. Taida nodded. Sillin and the others were silent. Was the difference between species really that big? I'll send you guys off here. I'm going to take another route. It's not in your track area, King Kong said. Okay, go play. Taida waved his hand. I'll find you after the test. Wait, King Kong, right? I want to ask, have you seen a huimao? A huimao this big? Sillin gestured and asked King Kong. King Kong scratched its head with its thick black fingers. If you're talking about that cat called Snore, then I've seen it. Yes, that's it. Do you know where it is now? Sillin asked again. King Kong shook its head. I saw it half an hour ago. It made Doll cry, so it left a deep impression on everyone. Doll is? A small crocodile the same size as me. A big crocodile was considered a small crocodile? If big meant about the same length, then it really wasn't small. It was a different story if it was based on age. Libero and the others were in disbelief when they heard this, including Taida. He couldn't imagine that the cat who had slept on the carpet with him not long ago could make a crocodile cry. Since it was King Kong's friend, then the crocodile was definitely not small. However, Sillin wasn't surprised. He sighed. That guy went to bully someone else again. After separating from King Kong, Sillin and the others continued on their way. They encountered a few groups of people along the way, and many were injured. Their injuries weren't serious, but it seemed that they were mainly psychological blows. They wondered how the people at the front were doing. If there wasn't enough food here, they had to find a solution. The fruits in the forest had all been taken by the people at the front, and the animals they encountered along the way weren't something they could kill. They could only find plants to fill their stomachs. In comparison, Sillin and the others were considered lucky. After all, the use of subspace wasn't forbidden here. They ran and stopped occasionally, and they had to find shelter to avoid bumping into the previous students. On the evening of the second day, Sillin finally met Huimao. Judging from the guy's expression, he seemed to be quite good at making friends. Sillin, let me introduce a new friend to you. He's right in front. Huimao raised his paw and pointed ahead. The area in front was surrounded by swamps and dense forests. Under the gradually darkening night, it looked even more strange. No one knew what was inside the forest or under the swamp. At the very least, Sillin's intuition told him that there was danger there. Not long ago, they heard a short and urgent scream from this side. After that, there was no movement after that, and by the time they arrived, there was already no one in sight. Because they knew that this area was full of hidden dangers, Sillin and the others decided to wait for a while and pass through after night. It would be slightly safer that way. You mean this area? Sillin raised his hand and gestured at the swamps and dense forests not far away. Yes, I have a friend there. He's quite a nice guy. Huimao squatted on Sillin's shoulder and wagged his tail. I even fought for him. Of course. Aren't you guys in a hurry? This is his territory. This way he can help you guys. Huimao was very proud. This was all thanks to him. Sillin called the other four and followed Huimao. Sillin, are we really going to go there at this time? Taida looked around and felt that the surroundings were spooky. There seemed to be a pair of big, cold eyes looking at them in the darkness. It's okay. Trust Wheeze. Yeah, trust me. That friend has a good temper. I'm not lying. You'll know when you see him. Huimao led the way in front, jumping around on the branches. It was late at night. Sillin and the others finally saw the good-tempered friend that Huimao mentioned. The area near the pond was filled with tall plants, and there, a big fellow was entrenched there. The scales covering its thick body reflected the starlight with a cold metallic light, and with the help of the cold light, they could see the dotted stripes and diamond-shaped patterns scattered all over its body. From time to time, they could see the sharpness of its forked tongue, and the long and thin pupils in its cold eyes stared straight at Sillin and the others. A creepy feeling that was colder than the night hit them. Chapter 242. Libero and the others stood there, looking at the giant snake that could easily swallow the four of them. If it weren't for Sillin saying that he believed in the cat, they would have long since fled. However, even if they took action now, the chances of success weren't high. They definitely wouldn't be able to defeat such a giant snake. At the very least, it was impossible for all 5 of them to retreat. Was this the good-tempered friend that the cat had mentioned? After seeing the snake's eyes, Wally wouldn't believe that this fellow had a good temper even if he was beaten to death. Snakes didn't have eyelids, so they couldn't blink. Thus, the current situation was that this giant snake was staring at them with eyes that seemed cold and cruel. It was as if a bucket of ice had been splashed on their faces, sending chills down their spines. Although this giant snake's eyes were cold, Sillin could see that its attitude towards Hui Mao wasn't bad. Its eyes weren't as cold as when it looked at them. The gray cat wagged its tail and ran over happily. It jumped onto the snake's thick body and stood on its slightly raised head. Then, it patted the snake's head with its paw and said, "Look, this is Bonner the giant snake, my new friend." "It's Senta," Bona added. Its voice sounded a little hoarse. It was natural, and every line of its voice had a natural sense of coldness. It was not like King Kong's childlike voice. However, if one were to ignore this point based on this sentence alone, the giant snake really wanted to express friendliness. It's the same meaning. After Hui Mao finished introducing Bona, he continued to introduce Sillin and the others. "Hello." Sillin stepped forward to greet him. The closer he got to Bona, the colder he felt. Because of Hui Mao, the giant snake had agreed to bring them out of the swamp. After all, it would take a lot of effort for them to safely leave the swamp. Moreover, there were many other traps in the swamp and jungle. Only an idiot wouldn't take advantage of such an opportunity. Thus, under the faint starlight, a snake with 5 people and a cat on its back left the swamp and jungle. The snake's body was very cold, and its scales felt a little metallic to the touch. Wally couldn't help but touch it a few times, but after being whipped by the snake's tail, he became much more obedient. "I've never been so close to such a big fellow before," Libro said with a sigh. "Me too." There was excitement in Taida's eyes. He had sat on King Kong's shoulder before, but King Kong was King Kong, and Serpent was Serpent. One belonged to the class of mammals, and the other belonged to the class of reptiles. They were different species, and the feeling they gave off was also very different. When Sillin's group swaggered through the swamp area on the back of the giant snake under the night sky, some other people hiding in the swamp area also noticed this unique combination. Originally, they were afraid of the big snake in this swamp forest area, so they had been very careful. When they found that the big snake was quickly coming towards them, some people sped up their pace and fled forward. As long as they got out of the swamp forest area, they would be fine. Some people felt that they might not be able to escape the big snake's pursuit, so they simply found a satisfactory place to hide in the surroundings. However, they found that the giant snake did not seem to see them. It did not chase after the people in front of it and continued to crawl at its original speed. When some of the people hiding in the surroundings saw that there was a person on the snake, their jaws almost dropped to the ground. After Bonner crawled through a dense forest area, another pair of eyes opened in a shrub with large leaves. If one looked carefully, they would see that there was actually a person hiding in the shrub. However, this person was like a chameleon. His skin had changed to the same color and pattern as the surroundings. Even his body temperature was similar to the surroundings. This way, even heat-sensitive animals would not be able to detect him. The person looked in the direction where the big snake was crawling and cursed, "Fuck, they're cheating." The competition didn't say that we weren't allowed to get close. "Who asked us to not know that snake?" said the other people hiding behind the shrub. Bonner was crawling forward with Sillin and the others when he suddenly stopped and looked back as if he was trying to confirm something. He then suddenly sped up. Ironhead almost fell off the snake. He only managed to grab onto the snake's scales and asked Sillin and the others, "What's wrong?" "Someone's coming," replied Sillin. Hui Mao jumped onto the snake's head and patted Bonner. "What's going on?" "A troublesome person is chasing after us." "Damn it, why is she in a place like this?" Bonner ran as fast as he could, as if he was running away from a disaster. Hui Mao could sense that the person chasing after them was a human, but the fact that Bonner was behaving in such a manner made him curious. The snake was fast, but the person chasing after it wasn't slow either. 5 minutes later, a voice came from behind. "Bonner, you bastard, stop right there." Although it was a woman's voice, it was too loud. It was so loud that the insects that had fallen asleep in this swamp area were startled awake, and they began to squeak. Is she using a megaphone? Wally had a look of disbelief on his face. Kenancy never uses that kind of thing. Her voice can make a megaphone explode. Bonner continued to run without looking back. Thus, in the swamp area, under the starlight of the night, a large snake was running as fast as it could, while a girl was chasing after it. From time to time, she would say a few words, but she didn't shout anymore. She was probably trying to conserve her strength, but it seemed that she wouldn't stop until she caught up to Bonner. Because of the girl's relentless pursuit, Bonner's speed was also quite fast. By dawn, he had already reached the edge of the swamp area. That girl is still chasing after him. Isn't her stamina a little too good? Libero sighed. If they were in each other's shoes, Libero believed that he wouldn't be able to maintain such a high speed for more than an hour, but that girl had been chasing after him for more than 4 hours. And she hadn't been shaken off by Bonner. She's quite aggressive. Wally looked at the snake that was trying its best to escape. He wondered how the snake had offended the girl. Sigh, women really can't be offended. After finally running out of the swamp area, Hui Mao jumped down with Silin and the others. "Bonner, hurry up and run." Bonner didn't pay much attention to Silin and the others. He changed directions and continued running. Silin and the others hadn't gone far when they heard a loud bang behind them. Looking back, he saw the huge snake rolling on the ground a few times after being beaten. In front of the snake stood a girl with 2 small braids hanging down from her temples and a ponytail at the back. She looked like she had just come out of the training ground. Silin felt that the girl looked familiar, but it was his first time seeing her. "Why are you running?" Kenancy stared at Bonner and panted. "I'm not running, I'm just crawling a little faster." Bonner insisted. "You're still trying to argue?" Bang. Another punch. Hui Mao's tail shook as he scratched his head with his claws. He then looked at Bonner, who was rolling on the ground a few more times. "It must hurt." "Kenancy, I'm telling you, snakes have a temper." Bonner roared. "Temper? You still dare to throw a temper?" Kenancy raised her voice. Seeing that the situation wasn't looking good, Hui Mao jumped onto Silin's shoulder and shouted at Bonner, "Brother, we'll be leaving first. Take care. If you want to run, then run. Why did you have to shout like that? Aren't you just angry at a snake? Can't you attract the enemy's firepower or something?" Bonner was so angry that he slapped the ground with his tail. "Fu, screw your ancestors. You ungrateful bastard. Meow, I don't have any ancestors." Hui Mao was telling the truth. It indeed didn't have any ancestors. It was a rare species in the universe, a naturally formed cyborg. Silin was speechless. Calling this cat brother really wasn't a good idea. Silin didn't know what happened to that pitiful big fellow. He only knew that they could still vaguely hear the commotion from afar. After passing through the swamps and forests, Silin's group passed through deserts and grasslands. They encountered a lot of strange creatures, and they caused quite a lot of trouble for the examinees who passed. In comparison, the previous term students caused much less trouble, and most of them just watched the show from the sidelines and chuckled. Therefore, they still had to pay attention to the local overlords. When they were about to leave the desert, Silin and the others saw a mutated armadillo lizard roll down the sandstone with its tail in its mouth. As it rolled, it mumbled, "Run, run." It didn't take long before a giant scorpion rushed out of the sandstone and crawled towards them. Silin and the others ran madly again. The gray cat originally wanted to give it a go, but Silin grabbed it by the back of its neck and dragged it along with him. It was better not to cause trouble now. Honestly speaking, this additional long-distance running had proven its usefulness to a certain group of people. For example, Wally was extremely resistant to drought. Even Libero and Ironhead, who were half-mutants, were much stronger than Taida. When Taida was traversing the desert, Silin and the others had to take turns to carry him on their backs most of the way. Some of the examinees Silin saw were in no better condition than them. Some of them were even dressed in rags and looked incredibly miserable. After all, not everyone had the privilege of being escorted by local tyrants like Vajra and Banner. When they finally finished one lap around the planet, everyone had the same thought. 1. We're finally done. 2. Thank God this planet isn't as big as the one AF1 was on. Some of the people who had been eliminated after this additional long-distance run had left of their own accord. After all, until now, the teachers of AF1 hadn't eliminated anyone on a large scale. Even for those who had fallen behind, the teachers of AF1 didn't eliminate them. 40% of the extra race depended on the result, and 60% on the process. The candidates thought that it would be time to rest after this long-distance run, but unfortunately, when 80% of them arrived, they were informed that they would be sent to another place to prepare for the next test. Those who had arrived at the front of the additional long-distance run had it better. They still had some time to rest while waiting, but those who were at the back really had to climb up the transport plane while panting. Sillin and the others had it better. They were at the front, so when they arrived, less than 30% of the candidates had finished the run. According to Taida, after the 3+1 test would be the cooperation test. Originally, everyone guessed that the candidates would form their own teams for the test, but they didn't expect that the so-called cooperation did not only refer to the candidates who had come to participate in the selection test. The number of people transported by this transport plane for the cooperative test was less than 700. After the transport plane had transported the candidates to their destination, Sillin and the others got off the plane with everyone else. They discovered that they were at a wide, open-air training ground. However, it was obvious that this wasn't a test venue, but a gathering place. Moreover, there were already a lot of people stretching their muscles. Before Sillin could discuss the cooperation test with Libero and the others, a voice came from the training ground. Sillin, it's really you. You're really my blood brother who doesn't share the same father and mother. What do you mean by blood brother who doesn't share the same father and mother? If your language teacher heard this, he would probably want to kill himself with a piece of tofu. The person shouting at the top of his voice was none other than the idiot Prince Bell. Zhen Xingming also ran over from the side. Sillin had a bad feeling when he saw the cheeky smiles on their faces. Bell ran over excitedly and gave Sillin a big hug under everyone's varied gazes. Then he slapped Sillin's shoulder hard and said, I was just talking about you, and you're already here. You're really my blood brother. Sillin, it's so good to see you again. I didn't think that you'd actually be in this batch of candidates. Zhen Xingming was just as excited as he was. Another person ran over after Bell and Zhen Xingming. According to Bell's words, Sillin guessed that this was Uliganuo of the Blizzard Windiska royal family who had been unlucky enough to be picked as the weakest pick and thrown into the army by his father. What's going on? Sillin slapped Bell's hand away and asked. Bell chuckled and didn't answer. He looked at Hui Mao and said, Wheeze, I've missed you so much. Hui Mao ignored Bell and stood on Sillin's shoulder with a straight face. He muttered to himself, Why didn't you say anything even if I missed you? I didn't even get a fish biscuit. Wheeze, I'll treat you to an all-fish meal and freshly baked fish biscuits at AF3's restaurant after the test. Bell added. Hui Mao grinned. I'm so happy to see you guys. Wally and the others. Seriously? While Bell and the others were chatting with Sillin, someone on the other side of the training field started shouting, Bell, you guys actually know someone over there. That's so unfair. You guys can be jealous and jealous all you want. Go find one yourself if you can. Bell said proudly. See, I actually know someone over here. He's going to enter AF1 and AF2 in the future. I'm not just a brother of his. Why is there a kid here? Uliganuo glanced at Taida, who was standing not far behind Sillin with Libero and the others. Bell and Zhen Xingming looked over when they heard Uliganuo's words. I just saw him. Taida was annoyed. You guys can't look down on my height like that. Who's this kid? Do you know him? Bell asked Sillin. Normally, there were other ways to monitor kids like this. There weren't many people who participated in the selection test with someone in their teens or 20s. Oh, his name is Taida. There's also Libero, Wally, and Ironhead next to him. The 5 of us will be sharing a room, Sillin said. Taida? Why does this name sound so familiar? You're that old muscle student? Bell was kicked away by Zhen Xingming before he could finish. Zhen Xingming turned around and smiled at Sillin and the others. Ignore him. He's been spouting nonsense lately. Chapter 243. After being kicked by Zhen Xingming, Bell clearly remembered that certain topics weren't suitable to be discussed in public. That was why he only chuckled a few times after he returned to the room. However, the way he looked at Taito was a little strange. Sillin didn't know why they were acting so strangely because of Taita's identity, but it didn't look like it was a good time to talk about it. He wouldn't press the issue any further. He would find out when the time came. Bell looked at Sillin's team of 5 and asked Sillin about the previous tests. Then, he turned around and asked Uliganuo, Gaga, what do you think? Want to team up? Gaga, Libero and the others looked at Uliganuo in unison. They didn't expect him to have such a funny nickname. In fact, most people in AF3 called him Ula, and only a few people who were close to him would call him Ganua. For example, the relatives of Blizzard and the Vendiska royals. Apart from them, his best friends like Bell and Zhen Xingming would call him Gaga, and only people like Bell and Zhen Xingming could call him Gaga. If anyone else called him Uliganuo, they would definitely be shot or beaten up. It was only after Bell's explanation that Sillin and the others learned what the 4th round of the cooperative test was like. The so-called cooperative test was a test in which the people of AF3 and the candidates would work together to form a team. There were 5 to 8 people in each team. There could be no less than 5 people and no more than 8 people. Of course, the teams with the same number of people could be made up of people from AF3, or they could be made up of examinees. Both the people of AF3 and the candidates really wanted to work together. The people of AF3 hoped to borrow the strength of the candidates, and the candidates hoped to learn a lot of information from the people of AF3. After all, the cooperative test was one of the tests the students of AF3 had to take during the semester, and it took up quite a large proportion of the test. They had no choice but to pay attention to it. When Bell, Zhen Xingming and the others first learned that they were coming here to take the test, they were filled with bitterness and thought about how to deal with it every day. Who would have thought that they would run into Sillin here? For candidates like Sillin and the others, this test was extremely important. After all, this was the 4th test of the 5th examination. After this test, there was only the final interview left. It wasn't easy for him to last until now, so he couldn't drop the ball. A familiar voice interrupted Bell and Sillin's conversation. Hey, you two know each other? Hearing this voice, Hui Mao shrank into Sillin's arms. He closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, but his ears were pricked up. It clearly remembered that Bonner had been beaten up by this girl and rolled on the ground, but he still didn't dare to throw a tantrum. Libero and the others trembled when they saw the girl walking over. What a coincidence! Bell waved his hand when he saw the newcomer. We're already full. You can find someone else to join your party. TSK, do you think I care? The girl's gaze swept across Sillin and the others before lingering on Hui Mao for 2 seconds. During these 2 seconds, Sillin could clearly feel Hui Mao stiffen in his arms. It was only when the girl moved her gaze away that he slowly relaxed. After the girl left, Bell looked at Sillin in confusion. You know my sister? No wonder I thought she looked familiar. She's your sister, your biological sister, isn't she? Sillin said. Yeah, my mother thinks that my sister Kenancy's like this is all because of me. She's being wronged. Bell complained. Both children had grown up in completely different ways than expected. This was a sore spot in the Fire Eagle royal consort's heart. Back in the day, Kenancy was sweet and adorable when she was young. Of course, she was still quite pretty now. After all, she had the excellent genes of royalty. When she was young, Kenancy was called Sweetheart Kenancy. She was the sweet little princess in the hearts of the royal consort and the Fire Eagle royal family. But now, the word sweetheart couldn't even begin to describe her. The animals of AF1 called her Diamond, Kenancy in private because she was incredibly strong and often went to AF1 to pick fights with the animals. Honor was one of them. Sillin didn't comment on Belle's words. We met your sister in the last round of the test. Jen Xingming and Uliganuo didn't react much to Sillin's explanation since they were already used to it. No wonder she disappeared as soon as we got here. She went to pick a fight again. Belle nodded. There weren't too many explanations given for the fourth round. The examinees only knew about the fourth round from the students from AF3. Because of this, some examinees were willing to team up with students from AF3. Some examinees were interested in the background of the students from AF3, while others were interested in the information that the students from AF3 had. Otherwise, who would be willing to team up with those pampered nobles? Sillin's team was already full. Belle and the other two were telling Sillin about the things he needed to pay attention to during the long test. That was why they didn't need to waste any more time looking for a team. The venue for the fourth test wasn't far away from them. It was a small garden in AF1. Of course, this garden wasn't as simple as it sounded. There were a lot of traps and dangers lurking in the garden, and the students from previous batches wouldn't just watch and play like they did during the third test. They would fight for real, which was why the students of AF3 were so eager to team up with the candidates. Although these nobles were usually arrogant and domineering, they knew their place. After all, it was very difficult for them to sneak past the students of AF1 and AF2 on their own. Suddenly, a whistling sound came from the sky above. A pair of giant wings flapped, stirring up a gust of wind and stirring up the sand and dust on the ground. The man flew over everyone's heads and stood on the railing at the edge of the training ground, looking down at the candidates below. Half of his wings were tucked behind his back, giving him an intimidating appearance. Yo, there's a lot of people here. Hearing this voice, Hui Mao scurried over to Sillin's shoulder and said softly, Yo, isn't this that guy? The person who appeared so coquettishly and stood on a high vantage point was Zani, whom Sillin had met the other day. Zani looked at the candidates below and said, This time, I'll be one of your opponents. I hope you won't meet me, hee. After saying that, Zani looked at the candidates who were obviously different from the ones from AF3. After the previous test, the candidates definitely didn't look as neat and tidy as the students from AF3. Although I really want to call you junior brothers and sisters, the problem is, I don't know if you have the right to call me senior brother in the end. There was no need to be sarcasm in this sentence. Only those who had been accepted would go back and call Zani senior brother. However, it was obvious that these people weren't the final lineup. After this and the next interview, some people would be eliminated. After saying that, Zani didn't care about the candidates' anger and flapped his wings to leave the training ground. Zani left the training ground and flew towards the testing ground for the fourth test. When he got close to the testing ground, two people wearing flight suits flew over. They had seen Zani's situation at the training ground. What's wrong, Zani? It's been less than half a minute. Based on your personality, shouldn't you have at least 5 minutes of speech time? The person laughed. Based on their understanding of Zani, Zani should have fiercely looked down on the candidates at the training ground. However, in reality, Zani only said a few words and then left. Zani curled his lips. I saw a guy who wasn't easy to deal with. I didn't want to waste time there. There's someone you don't want to mess with? Who is it? Before Zani could reply, a few other former students like Zani and the others came over. They didn't have wings, nor were they wearing flight suits. Their jumping ability was indeed very strong. They could jump very far from a small tree, and the sound they made was very soft, like the sound of sand being blown up by the wind. After hearing what Zani and the others said, he said, Did you guys see the kid who got the K? The kid who got the K? Yeah, he's the guy who got the Purgatory Thunder Snake K in the shooting ground during the selection test. Purgatory Thunder Snake K. Zani's tone had changed. He had just returned from a mission, and he hadn't watched the first few tests at all. How could he not be surprised when he heard this? That was the Purgatory Thunder Snake K they were talking about. Only Guanfeng would give away a Purgatory Thunder Snake K. You guys don't know? Then who are you talking about? Zani thought for a moment before pulling up an image stored on his communicator. Is it him? The image Zani pulled up was none other than Silin. Yes, it's him. He went into the shooting ground with a crate and got 50 out of 5 shots. I knew it, Zani flapped his wings. I'll be leaving first. Take your time. After saying goodbye to the others, Zani flew in a certain direction. Not long after, he saw Goryo playing a game on a tree branch. Hey, I just met your future junior brother. Goryo didn't even look up from his game. Your teacher gave the K to the guy who dodged 4 of your shots. I know. Goryo continued playing. You really don't know that you've fallen out of favor at all. Zani looked exasperated. Goryo snorted. You should tell that to the others. Teacher brought that kid here to deal a blow to people's confidence. Then are you going to meet them when they come in? Zani asked. Goryo answered straightforwardly. Then I'm not going either. If his aim is accurate, then I'll be in trouble. If his aim isn't accurate, then I'll be in trouble too. After all, the Purgatory Thunder Snake's accidental damage rate is way too high. There was no way he was going to do something as unrewarding as this. While Zani and Goryo were talking, the students and examinees of AF3 had entered the testing area in small groups. Since it was called AF1's Little Garden, there were plenty of flowers and trees, but there were also plenty of poisonous creatures. The most interesting thing about this place was that most of the species here had been taught in AF3 before. If the students had paid attention to their lectures, they would have a much easier time here, or at least they would have a better understanding of the subject. But the problem was, how many students from AF3 like Belle who had come here to participate in the semester examinations were actually paying attention to their lectures? It was already good enough that they didn't skip class. That was why the AF3 students beat their chests and stomped their feet in frustration when they saw some of the familiar yet inexplicable species. Why didn't they pay attention to this class back then? No wonder the instructor was laughing like a thief after class. Belle, Jen Xingming, and the others felt the same way. I feel like I'm being tricked by the botany instructor, Belle said. I've only been to his class less than 3 times. There are a lot of species that I don't recognize. Jen Xingming stared at the little white flowers in front of him. He remembered the old botany instructor saying that they were poisonous, but he didn't know if it was the flowers, the leaves, or the roots. Either way, they're poisonous. Iliganuo decisively avoided the little white flowers. Libero and the others were a little speechless. These children from AF3 really didn't know how to cherish their time. Many people wanted to enter the affiliated schools, but these people who were in the affiliated schools were busy skipping classes. It was really infuriating to compare oneself with others. Huimao didn't follow Silin here. Pets weren't allowed in this exam, so Huimao went to make friends with his new friends. Silin looked at the little white flowers and sniffed them. Then, he used a knife to cut open the stems and leaves. Looking at the sticky, transparent liquid that flowed out, he said, "This liquid is poisonous. It's a neurotoxin, but it won't kill you. At most, it'll knock you out." Silin collected some of this liquid. Belle and the others thought of something and collected some as well. That way, they would have some tricks up their sleeves if they ran into any enemies. What's that sound? Wally pricked his ears. It sounds like a child crying, Titus said. That's a man-eating salamander. It's pretty dangerous, but there's a water source over there. Belle knew about this. They had all taken that zoology class. Man-eating salamanders were amphibians. They had a flat front body and a flat tail. There were obvious skin folds on both sides of their bodies. Their bodies were smooth and scaleless, but they were covered in all kinds of stripes and mucus. Their teeth were sharp and dense. They didn't chew on their prey, but swallowed it whole. They could easily swallow an adult. There was indeed a stream over there. Silin and the others just stood and looked at it from afar. There were grayish-brown creatures about 5 meters long lying on the sides of the stream and some protruding rocks. They were all screaming, and when they screamed, they revealed their fine, sharp teeth. "Let's go. Don't provoke these violent guys," Belle said. Not long after Silin's group left the stream belt, Silin suddenly stopped in his tracks and looked towards a certain direction. After Silin stopped in his tracks, The rest of them also reacted swiftly and took defensive stances. However, when they saw who was slowly walking towards them, Belle and the others immediately hid behind Silin. Zhen Xingming was the fastest of them all. Silin looked at the person slowly walking towards them. Everyone could guess who he was. After all, this person looked quite similar to Zhen Xingming, but he definitely wasn't a candidate or a student of AF3. Chapter 244. Another member of the Zhen family? That person approached from afar, showing no signs of stopping. Celine did not move either. Just like that, she watched as he got closer and closer. Suddenly, Celine's pupils shrank. She tilted her head slightly to look at a large tree beside that person. The next moment, a woman appeared on the trunk of the large tree. The woman's hair was cropped to her ears, and her eyes were sharp despite the smile on her face. A single glance from her was enough to make a person feel an invisible pressure. There was a tiger's tooth blade stuck in her leather ankle boot. Needless to say, everyone knew that this woman wasn't easy to deal with. The sound she made when she landed on the tree was no different from a leaf falling on a tree trunk. If Libero hadn't seen her appear on the tree with his own eyes, he wouldn't have been able to detect her presence with his ears alone. Just like that, the woman crossed her arms and stared at Silin's group with a hint of a smile on the corner of her eyes. It was obvious that she was one of the former students. "Xingyao, no wonder you're running this way. Your younger brother is here," the woman said as she glanced at Zhen Xingming, who was standing behind Silin. Zhen Xingyao didn't say anything. He shot a glance at Silin, who was hiding behind Silin, before shifting his attention back to Zhen Xingming. Belle poked his head out from behind Silin and said to Zhen Xingyao, "Hey, second brother Zhen, can't you be merciful and pretend that you didn't see us?" Zhen Xingming remained silent. He knew his brother's personality all too well. There was no way he would let them go after running into them. They could only fight. Belle looked at the woman standing on the tree with a pitiful expression after Zhen Xingyao ignored him. "Sister Sula, please have mercy." Sula stomped her foot lightly on the ground, and the tiger's fang blade that was stuck in her short boot flew into the air. She gripped the blade tightly and looked at Belle with a smile. "I'm sorry, Your Highness Belle, but I can't break the rules either. If I do, my pay will be deducted. You know that the fixed allowance we students receive isn't even enough to buy you a car door. If I lose it again, I'll have to resort to robbery." Belle, Zhen Xingming, and Ulagacha retreated at the same time, knowing that this battle was unavoidable. Zhen Xingming grabbed Taida by the collar and pulled him back, leaving the battlefield to Silin, Libero, Ironhead, and Wally. Wally glanced at Silin and the others who were still standing where they were, then turned around to look at Zhen Xingming and the others who had retreated to hide behind a tree not far away. Then he ran towards them as well. "Aren't you going to fight?" Zhen Xingming and the other two were astonished. Normally speaking, weren't the participants of the 5th grade exam pretty enthusiastic? Wally shook his head and squeezed Belle a little deeper into the crowd. "Please leave some space for me." Now only Silin, Libero, and Ironhead were left on the other side. Suddenly remembering something, Zhen Xingming mustered his courage and poked Silin again. He whispered, "Don't use those two things unless it's absolutely necessary." Then, Zhen Xingming slipped back behind the tree like his but was on fire and watched the battle unfold with Belle and the others. The two things Zhen Xingming was referring to were the Purgatory Thunder Snake K and the blade. Zhen Xingming was his older brother after all, and he believed in Silin's abilities. That was why he knew very well just how destructive those two things in Silin's possession could be. In fact, Silin wouldn't have thought of using those two things even if Zhen Xingming hadn't mentioned it. He had been looking forward to fighting against a member of the Zhen family for a long time now. Sula twirled the tiger fang blade in her hand and ran towards Libero and Ironhead in a whoosh. Before participating in the test, Libero knew that they had no chance of winning against these former students if they kept fighting like this. Therefore, some sharp spikes started growing out of Libero's body before Sula jumped over. Then, some dark-colored hard material quickly appeared on the surface of his body, and 3 rows of bone plates popped out of his back. The tips of the bone plates were as sharp as blades. Ironhead, on the other hand, didn't have bone plates like Libero's, but his entire body glowed with a metallic luster. His entire body looked like a solidified metal. A mutant? Sula twisted her body in midair when she came into contact with the bone plates on Libero's back. The tip of her foot tapped on one of the bone plates and spun around. A steel claw popped out of her wrist and covered her fingers like a glove. Zzzt, Sula grabbed the largest bone plate on Libero's back with the steel claw and swung her arm. Bang! Libero's entire body was smashed into the ground. Sula didn't continue attacking Libero after the successful attack. Instead, she evaded Ironhead's punch and let out a screeching noise when her steel claw made contact with Ironhead's body. Sparks of metal could be seen from the friction, but the claw only left a few shallow scratches on Ironhead's body. Sula flipped over and lay flat on the tree trunk. She glanced at her blunt steel claws and flung them away. Her claws had been damaged to a certain extent when she grabbed onto the bone plate on Libero's back, and the wear and tear on her iron head meant that she couldn't use them anymore. It must have taken a lot of effort for these two half-mutants to make it this far. Sula smiled and continued to charge at Ironhead. On the other side, Silin and Zhen Xingyao had also begun fighting. The Zhen family liked to use their palms when they fought alone. This was the conclusion Silin had learned from Zhenya. Punching the skin and hitting the insides with their palms. Only when palm techniques were used to a certain degree would they have the power to damage the insides. Silin had learned a bit about the destructive power of palm strikes from Zhenya, but Zhenya's body wasn't in good shape at the time. Moreover, Zhenya had taught Silin some modified techniques that were used to nourish one's body. Silin wouldn't lose to Zhen Xingyao in terms of speed. That was why Zhen Xingyao didn't find a suitable opportunity to attack during the first exchange. However, it wasn't to say that Zhen Xingyao didn't have the speed to do so. When Zhen Xingyao increased his speed, Silin assumed a defensive stance because he knew that Zhen Xingyao's counterattack was coming. Triple stack palm. The continuous palm shadows overlapped each other, and each palm was stronger than the last. It looked very imposing, but Celine knew that the threefold palm was not a killing move. Instead, it was part of a killing move, and its purpose was not to kill. Zhenya had demonstrated the killer move before, and although it wasn't complete since he couldn't execute it in his current condition at the time, Silin had learned a thing or two from the explanation. Therefore, he had a way to deal with Zhen Xingyao's triple fold palms. The one that could counter the triple stack palm was water-severing draw. There was no blade, and there was no need for a blade. Silin shook his arms, and as his arms moved, the airflow around him also began to become unstable. Two strong convection movements caused by his arms swiftly formed a strong airflow vortex that rotated at high speed. Like a sharp blade that appeared out of nowhere, it charged upwards diagonally and forcefully cut through the 3 layers of hand shadows. Water-severing draw couldn't counter a killer move, but the triple stack palm that was a part of a killer move wasn't impossible to counter. Silin rarely used these techniques back when he was in a hunter regiment. Back then, he was a hunter, and all he used in battle were killer moves. They weren't complicated or flashy, but they were all killer moves that could kill in one hit. However, Silin wanted to give it a try since he ran into someone from the Zhen family. It had been a long time since he last used water-severing draw, but it still felt so familiar to him now that it was almost an instinct. When the triple stack palm was formed, water-severing draw had appeared in Silin's mind on its own. Zhen Xingyao paused for a moment after withdrawing his palm because of water-severing draw. He looked at Silin with a slightly strange and doubtful gaze, but he didn't pause for long before he launched the next round of attacks. Hiding behind a tree and watching the battle, Bell nudged Zhen Xingming with his elbow and whispered, "Don't you think that Silin is a little too calm? It's like he can predict what move he's going to make next. He also seems to know which ones are killer moves and which ones aren't. I don't know what kind of moves the Zhen family uses, but I have a feeling that Silin is very familiar with them. Otherwise, your brother should be able to find a way to attack even if he doesn't intend to use a killer move." Zhen Xingming frowned and didn't answer Bell's question. His thoughts drifted back to the battle on the rooftop of the bar that day. When Silin pulled out his blade to block Goryo's bullet, Zhen Xingming had caught a brief glimpse of it. Although it was only for a brief moment, Silin's movements when he pulled out the blade were somewhat similar to water severing draw. This was one of the reasons why Zhen Xingming suddenly felt a sense of familiarity. Why was it one of the reasons? Because there was another sense of familiarity that Zhen Xingming hadn't found yet. Xingming, do you think Silin might be the illegitimate child of someone in your family? Iliganuo asked while rubbing his chin. Although many nobles lived a rotten life, they valued legitimate birth very much. This was especially true for the 4 nobles who stood at the top of the hierarchy, the monarch and the 3 kings. Only those with legitimate birth would be recognized. Those with illegitimate birth would most likely be killed, and those nobles who had an illegitimate birth would be severely punished. Therefore, even if Zhen Xingming liked to pick up girls, there were some things that he had to be extra careful about. If he accidentally created a child with an illegitimate birth, his old man would definitely break his leg. Zhen Xingming kicked Iliganuo's foot when he heard what he said. Bullshit. Everyone with legitimate birth in the Fuji Zhen family in Upper Tree has proof, and those with illegitimate birth will be killed. If Silin really was the illegitimate child of someone in the Zhen family, then Silin would be killed by the upper echelons of the Fuji royal family. This was something that Zhen Xingming and the others didn't want to see, so no one brought up the topic again. However, Zhen Xingming couldn't help but think that way even if they didn't bring it up. While Zhen Xingming was in a dilemma, Zhen Xingyao's surroundings began to change. The distorted air currents refracted light, and Zhen Xingyao's figure turned blurry for a time. Many parts of his body appeared, and it was impossible to tell where Zhen Xingyao actually stood. Blinded by a single leaf, Silin wasn't in a hurry to act. Instead, he stood where he was and waited quietly with his hands hanging by his sides. Suddenly, Silin made his move. The moment Silin decided to act, a palm broke through the distorted light and slapped at Silin's side. Silin had no doubt that his internal organs would be severely injured if he was hit by this palm. It was still a reflexive movement. The disturbed arm drew an arc in the air, shook violently, and sent out a palm strike that was 70 to 80% similar to the one that broke through the light. The thread in Zhen Xingming's brain snapped when he saw this. Impossible. If he wasn't a member of the Zhen family, if he wasn't a core member of the Zhen family, there was no way he would know this move. Even if it was only 70 to 80% similar, but... Bell exchanged a glance with Iliganuo when he saw Zhen Xingming's clenched fists. They sandwiched Zhen Xingming in the middle to prevent him from doing something bad on impulse. After a loud boom, Silin and Zhen Xingyao both retreated. Neither side seemed to be hurt, but 2 seconds later, the sleeves of their arms that had clashed with each other turned to dust. Coincidentally, Silin was using his left arm, and the glove on his hand had turned to dust because of the palm strike. A curly green pattern in the shape of a leaf stuck tightly to the knuckle of Silin's left thumb. Zhen Xingyao had lost all will to fight the moment he saw this pattern. Chapter 245. In the Fuji royal Zhen family, only those of legitimate birth in every generation would have the proof of being a member of the Upper Tree Fuji Zhen family. However, that was only proof of legitimate birth, not proof of identity. Was there a difference between proof of birth and proof of identity? Perhaps there was no difference between the two for a normal person, but there was a huge difference for a royal family like the Zhen family. There were a lot of people in the Zhen family who had proof of legitimate birth. In Zhen Xingming's generation, there were a few cousins who had proof of legitimate birth other than himself and his siblings. But proof of identity was a different story. The Zhen family's proof of identity wasn't something any ordinary person could get their hands on. Take Zhen Xingming's generation for example. Only Zhen Xingming, Zhen Xingyao, and a few other blood-related brothers had the special proof of identity because their father was the current King Fuji, so they had a special proof of identity that was different from the rest of the Zhen family. For example, there was a leaf pattern on Zhen Xingyao's wrist that looked like a bracelet. Of course, if the next King Fuji wasn't chosen from one of them, then the final King Fuji would have the same proof of identity. However, the Zhen family was different from the Fire Eagle royal family. Most of the time, the Zhen family's heir to the throne was passed down from the previous King Fuji to his own son. Therefore, the bloodline was more concentrated. However, what shocked Zhen Xingyao the most was why Silin had a proof of identity that belonged to the Zhen family. Moreover, it definitely didn't belong to their generation. In their generation, proof of identity wasn't attached to their fingers, but to their wrists or arms. Zhen Xingyao didn't doubt the authenticity of the leaf pattern on Silin's finger at all. His attention wasn't on Silin's finger just now, but the moment the glove on Silin's hand turned to dust, a sense of familiarity and an inexplicable attraction suddenly forced Zhen Xingyao's attention. That was why Zhen Xingyao's original intention to cause trouble for Zhen Xingming and the others vanished completely. What could possibly be more important than the Zhen family? However, Zhen Xingyao wondered which generation the proof of identity on his finger belonged to. His father's generation seemed to have a badge attached to his chest. As for his grandfather's generation, Zhen Xingyao's pupils contracted and his heart pounded. It was just a blurry memory and he wasn't sure, but it seemed like his grandfather's generation was one of those people. The more Zhen Xingyao thought about it, the more he felt that something was wrong. The more he thought about it, the more he wanted to ask his grandfather about it. After all, they didn't know much about the matters of their grandfather's generation. However, if they were to suddenly ask about it, who knew how big of a wave the Zhen family would cause? Just as Zhen Xingyao let go of his offensive instincts and his expression flickered with a myriad of thoughts, Zhen Xingming and the others grew impatient. Due to the angle, Zhen Xingming and the others didn't see the leaf pattern on Silin's finger. Silin put his hand back into his pocket after the leaf pattern appeared. Silin had been planning to reveal the leaf curl pattern to the public since the beginning. He had planned to start with Zhen Xingming, but he never found a good opportunity to do so. Moreover, Zhen Xingming didn't look very reliable, and there was no telling what would happen if he learned about it. Therefore, Silin decided to reveal the information to Zhen Xingyao the moment he ran into him. As expected, Zhen Xingyao was a lot calmer than Zhen Xingming. He didn't make a fuss after seeing the leaf pattern on Silin's finger. Instead, he was thinking about the best way to deal with the situation and prioritize the bigger picture. Zhen Xingming was about to speak when he saw that the other side had stopped, but Zhen Xingyao shot him a look. They were blood brothers after all, and some things didn't need to be said out loud. A look was enough to understand what the other was trying to convey. After receiving the hint from Zhen Xingyao's eyes, Zhen Xingming's plan to interrogate Silin and clarify the doubts in his heart was put on hold. He knew that Zhen Xingyao must have discovered more clues. When it came to proper business, Zhen Xingming himself knew that it was better to listen to his brother Zhen Xingyao. Since Zhen Xingyao wasn't planning to continue, Sula, who had just decided to incapacitate Libero and Ironhead, stopped attacking as well. She tossed Ironhead away and didn't attack again. It took a long time for Ironhead to return in a daze. Libero, who had been smashed into the ground again and again before the bone plate on his back could do much, slowly came back to his senses. He shook his head a few times to clear his mind. I hope you won't tell anyone about some things before I figure them out. Zhen Xingyao's words were thick with warning, and he left quickly after that. The task of supervising Silin had been passed to Zhen Xingming. Sula shot Silin a puzzled look, but she didn't ask. After all, even if there was a problem, it was the Fuji royal family's problem. She wasn't stupid enough to get involved. She flicked her finger lightly and put the tiger tooth blade back into her boot. Then she left behind a meaningful smile and left. It took Libero and Ironhead a long time to regain their consciousness after the duo had left. Fuck, that woman is too strong. She's so strong alone. Libero said while rubbing the wounds on his body after he had returned to his normal state. Silin nodded in agreement. Of course she was strong. Using the League of Stars' standards, Sula's genotype was A rank. It would be strange if she wasn't strong after her training. People like Zhen Xingming and Belle who had good genes might not necessarily be as strong as someone with bad genes who had gone through strict training. However, they didn't need to deal with this on their own. There were plenty of powerful people protecting them, and every one of them was loyal to them. This was the privilege of nobles, and it was perfectly normal under such a system. Silin had seen Libero and Ironhead before. Using the League of Stars' standards, Libero's genotype was A rank, and Ironhead's genotype was slightly weaker. However, they might not necessarily lose to Sula after joining the affiliated school and undergoing training. It was obvious that Zhen Xingming wasn't treating Silin as naturally as he used to be. In fact, he even wondered if Silin was one of his illegitimate children who had been forced to live on the streets for a long time. Although he didn't see the leaf pattern on Silin's hands, the way Silin fought Zhen Xingyao was enough to make Zhen Xingming think that way. However, Taida didn't think that much. He simply thought that Silin was very strong. The fact that he was able to fight Zhen Xingyao to this extent was already amazing enough. After all, Libero and Ironhead had been beaten up badly by Sula in comparison. Taida admired the strong a lot because the education and environment he had grown up in was different from royalty like Belle and the others. He didn't want to be protected by others all the time like a fragile object. That was why he quickly agreed to participate in the affiliated school's selection test when his father mentioned it. Taida followed behind Silin and asked Silin about his usual training techniques. His father once said that a strong person couldn't do without strict training. Silin selectively answered some of Taida's questions and made his answers vague. After all, he couldn't very well tell a child's older brother that his current achievements were due to his years of experience in the battlefield, could he? Wouldn't that be asking a child to kill someone? Not every child could smash a person's head off without batting an eyelid like Tang Qiuqiu. Strangely enough, Silin and the others didn't run into any other past graduates after Zhen Xingyao and Sula showed up. It should be noted that the past graduates were the ones who had given them a show of strength, and it was also the affiliated school's permission to let the past graduates teach the examinees and EF3 students a lesson. The past graduates were more than happy to do so. They could transfer the anger they usually received from their instructors to these people and let them experience the pain they had become numb to. However, the current situation was that Silin and the others didn't run into any past graduates for a long time. They did run into a few other teams, but they only casually chatted about their encounters and brushed past each other without saying much. A few figures gathered together at a valley that Silin and the others had just passed by. "Are you really not going to meet that kid?" one of them asked. "Nope. You can go if you want," another person answered. Another person curled his lips. "That kid is going to EF1 for sure anyway. It's not too late to meet him after he actually gets into EF1. We'll get to watch a good show then." "Hey, you're wrong. What do you mean wait for him to get into EF1? How are you so sure that he'll get into EF1 in the end? Maybe he'll be assigned to EF2 in the end. It's Teacher Griffin who recommended him." Griffin was an instructor at EF2, and her words carried a lot of weight in EF2. "TSK, why don't you think about who gave that kid the Purgatory Thunder Snake K? It's that old Fox Guan. Do you think that old Fox Guan will let him go? Of course he'll be assigned to EF1. Nothing is absolute." While the past graduates were debating about where Silin would end up, Silin himself wasn't in the mood to think about it. He didn't really care about EF1 or EF2, and the instructors he had were all the same. Right now, Silin was studying a few plants that he encountered along the way, but none of them knew anything when he asked Belle and the others. What was the difference between monocotyledons and dicotyledons? What was the difference between gymnosperms and angiosperms? Belle and the others couldn't answer these basic questions. All they could do was shake their heads, and there was no way they could ask any deeper questions. In the end, Silin could only ponder on his own. He couldn't count on these three good-for-nothings. Even if they told him that chrysanthemum leaves were coriander, Silin would still doubt the validity of their answers. Since there were no past graduates to interfere, Silin's group only needed to pay attention to the traps and the attacks of other creatures in the area. However, these were all trivial matters. Silin, Libero, and Ironhead had already taken care of them. Therefore, for Taida, this test was basically a trip to catch and eat wild game. The little guy was having a lot of fun. A few days later, Silin's group exited the area. Judging from their current condition, injuries, and time of arrival, their results weren't bad. At the very least, Belle and the others had gotten a good score in this test. When they saw the injuries of the candidates who came out later, Silin's group was much luckier than they were. Libero and Ironhead couldn't help but sigh. They were only covered in superficial wounds, unlike the other candidates who had broken tendons and broken bones. Perhaps some of them had been severely beaten by the past graduates and were severely dispirited, but some of them were the type to grow stronger with every setback. That being said, no matter how serious their injuries were, it wouldn't stop them from participating in the next test, which was the final test of the 5th exam, the interview. After the 4th test, Silin's group of 5 separated from Belle and the others. Before they parted ways, Zhen Xingming ran over to Silin and said a few words to Silin in private. He wanted to tell Silin to keep a low profile for the time being, especially when it came to the Zhen family. He wanted to wait until his brother figured out what was going on. Silin had no objections. If he couldn't find the answer himself, he would leave it to his brothers. Zhen Xingming left a little awkwardly after receiving a nod from Silin. He was even thinking that he wouldn't see another brother the next time they met. As for the rest of the candidates, they all thought that the last test should be the easiest since they had passed the first 4 tests, right? Wasn't the interview just talking to the teachers? However, the previous graduates who had the same experience didn't think so. Although the final interview was indeed just a matter of talking, you had to be able to move your body first. When Silin entered the interview hall, he saw a circle of teachers sitting inside the circular hall. The candidates who came for the interview were sitting at the center. Everyone's gaze was focused on him, giving him the illusion that he was a monkey being watched. Silin didn't have stage fright. It's not like he was going to lose a piece of flesh, right? After calmly sitting down, one of the instructors smiled amiably. He flipped through the information in his hands and asked, "Your results in the written test are not bad. Looking at your general situation, you seem to have a certain level of understanding in the field of genes." "A little bit," Silin answered. "All right then, I'll ask you about genetics." The leading teacher tapped the table with his finger as if he wanted to ask something. After some thought, the teacher asked with interest, "You've met King Kong before, haven't you? That naughty chimpanzee?" "All right then. Tell me, between you and King Kong, whose Y chromosome is bigger?" "Silin." "Fuck." Chapter 246. Although it was just an interview, and although it didn't require as much energy as the previous tests, most people would rather undergo those physical tests than go through this kind of crazy mental test. The people in front of Silin had all left through another door, so those waiting for the interview couldn't communicate with those who had already finished the interview. However, Silin didn't need to ask to know how those who had already finished the interview would react. Silin looked at the teachers in the interview hall who had friendly smiles on their faces, but who gave him the urge to smack them with a brick. He sighed in his heart. What kind of topic were these people asking? Finally, the main teacher changed after asking 2 questions. Next to him, an old scholar with a RAS badge flipped through the information and said to Silin, "I've seen your written test answers. You have some understanding of zoology. So let me ask you, if you were a coelenterate, like a sea anemone, and if you were a sea anemone, what kind of partner would you find?" Silin, why did he have to use a sea anemone, a primitive and simple animal that only had a mouth but no anus, ate and excreted through the same mouth, and didn't even have the most basic brain as an example? What kind of partner would he find? If one didn't know how to answer, the best way to do so was to ask directly. "May I ask if the sea anemone you're talking about is a hermaphrodite or a dioecious type?" Silin looked at the old scholar. "Does a sea anemone need to find a partner?" The old scholar smiled kindly. "Does a sea anemone have the ability to find a partner?" "No." "Have you studied it before?" 5 minutes later, the old scholar finally let go of Silin and put down the information with a smile. He picked up the glass of water next to him and began to drink tea slowly. The next person to ask the question was a gentle middle-aged man, but Silin wouldn't classify him as a perverted teacher just because of his appearance. "Don't be nervous. I won't ask those disgusting questions," the gentle middle-aged man said. Silin curled his lips in his heart. "As if I'd believe you." The middle-aged man opened a holographic screen. There was a paragraph of text on it. This is a paragraph from AF1 Student Code of Conduct. It's not very long, only about 1,000 words. The content is also very simple, So my request is for you to read this paragraph in 2 languages. Silin looked at the words on the holographic screen and thought to himself, sure enough, none of these tutors are easy to deal with. Because, although the words on the holographic screen were not long, the problem was that the order was reversed. It was much more difficult to read a passage backwards than to follow it. The simpler the vocabulary and the more common the language, the easier it was to mispronounce it. This was because your brain had a habit of thinking. When you understood the meaning, you would reflexively read the word out loud instead of reading it backwards. And in 2 languages. As expected, he was deliberately making things difficult for others. Silin thought for a moment before reading the words on the light screen again. First, he used the dialect of Old Man Chang's planet to read the words out loud. Then, he used the common language of the Empire to read the words out loud. Silin was quite satisfied with himself after he finished reading the words. He didn't pause too mechanically, and he didn't make any mistakes. Not bad. The middle-aged man nodded and turned off the holographic screen. With a harmless expression, he said, "Then, please recite what you just said. Don't be nervous, just recite as much as you can." Fortunately, Silin had a good memory. Coupled with the fact that he had practiced reverse thinking when he was assembling parts, it did not take much effort for him to answer the middle-aged man's question. After Silin recited the passage fluently, the middle-aged man nodded and gestured for the next tutor to ask the question. He then buried his head in writing. After the middle-aged man, there was a fashionably dressed woman with an intellectual aura. She did not look like she was going through menopause, but since she was sitting here, Silin was sure that this woman was more difficult to deal with than the menopausal women he had met before. The female tutor did not smile. Seeing that it was her turn to ask a question, she asked directly, "Do you know about the incident with the Bistrit family?" "I know a little." Silin had learned a little about it from some media. The Bistrit family was a medium noble family, not some small noble family. However, they were too unscrupulous and had violated the Empire's laws in many private matters. Not long ago, the entire planet was seriously polluted because of their medicine production. Then, they failed to take effective measures immediately, causing the nearby residential planets to be infected as well. Billions of people fell ill, and more than 10 million people died. This incident was the fuse that led to the Bistrit family's downfall. After the pollution incident, the other families who disliked the Bistrit family or were enemies of the Bistrit family joined forces and appealed to the Mist Bodhisattva royal family. After a lot of effort on the 3 kings' side, the Mist Bodhisattva Emperor finally announced that the Bistrit family's noble title would be revoked. Many people applauded and cheered. "Very well. Please tell us your thoughts on this matter." Silin let out a sigh of relief when he heard the female tutor's question. This kind of question was easier to answer. After all, a lot of media outlets had reported about the incident, so Silin gave a brief explanation based on the information they had obtained. However, he didn't go into too much detail about his own opinion. It was because he had only learned about the incident from the media. The media's opinion would guide the public's opinion, and no one knew what was really going on behind the scenes. What you see may not be the truth, and what you hear may not be the truth. However, if you really want to give a subjective opinion, you can't say anything without investigating the matter yourself. Therefore, the above is limited to, Silin gave a brief explanation. He didn't think that the female tutor wanted to hear a long speech from him, nor did she want to hear Silin criticize the filthy nobles. Therefore, after Silin's brief explanation, the female tutor looked quite satisfied. However, this wasn't her only question. She asked another one. More than 10 days ago, an alien riot occurred on a planet in the 22nd star region of the Empire. However, not long after, a rare large-scale natural disaster occurred on that planet. Some people said that this was God's punishment for the rioting aliens. What do you think? What a sensitive topic. This was to test Silin's opinion on the aliens. These questions weren't only the female tutors, but also the questions asked by the previous few tutors. Not only did they test Silin's understanding of certain aspects, but they also tested Silin's character as a person. The fifth exam of the AF5 tested the physical, psychological, and physical defects of the candidates. The physical and psychological defects of the candidates had already been tested, and the psychological defects of the candidates had also been observed in the previous tests. In the last interview, they would test again to see if this person was extreme, racist, or crazy. After all, there was only a thin line between a genius and a lunatic. After answering the female tutor's question, the other tutors asked their own questions as well. Their questions were just as perverted as before. This interview was seriously the strangest and most unbearable interview Silin had ever experienced in his life. There were even some questions that were not suitable for children that the instructors could ask him like they were researching an academic problem. If these tutors were the ones teaching AF1 and AF2, then there probably wouldn't be many normal students in the end. No wonder Bell said that the students of AF1 and AF2 were all abnormal. Even a normal person would come out of AF1 and AF2 completely different. Silin felt that his interview time was too long. Some of the people before him didn't even have this much time. What Silin didn't know was that it was exactly because he was jointly recommended by Griffin and Guanfeng that the mentors were asking him questions so enthusiastically. Griffin wasn't the only one, and the Gen family was also adding fuel to the fire from behind the scenes. That was why Silin's interview time was the longest. The people lining up behind Silin were still wondering if the interviewing instructors had taken a break. Otherwise, why hadn't they called for the next candidate after such a long time? He had been feeling restless for a long time already. When Silin walked out of the interview room, he felt as if he had just been released from prison and seen the light of day again. He turned around and looked at the interview room that had already closed its doors. He wondered if coming to AF1 was the right decision after all. After the interview was over, the candidates could return to their temporary dorms and wait for the final announcement. When Silin returned, Libero and Ironhead were already there. Both of them looked listless. It looked like the interview was a big blow to them. According to Ironhead, one of the tutors asked him, "How many rocks are there in a 1-kilometer radius around the interview hall?" Ironhead didn't answer. "Are you stupid? Can't you just say a number? It's not like the tutors are going to check it for real." Hui Mao said disdainfully. Ironhead sighed. The problem is, the tutor added, "Please prove it," after asking the question. Hui Mao stopped talking and turned his head to eat his fish biscuit. Although Ironhead was depressed when the interview ended, he felt much better knowing that everyone's situation was similar. The results of AF1's fifth test came out soon. Those who were accepted would be given a communicator. When the time came, someone would contact you through this communicator. The 5 people in Silin's dorm received the communicator. Ironhead and Libero were quite excited, while Taida and Wally were much calmer. However, as soon as Taida received the communicator, he was taken away by the old servant who had brought him here. Wally was also called away by a communicator on the same day and never returned. The next day, someone came to pack Wally's things. They said they were Wally's senior brothers. What did they mean by senior brothers? Most of the candidates who were accepted would be assigned to a mentor based on the results of the 5 tests, and the former students under that mentor would have a close relationship with the new candidates. As for the former students under other mentors, although they would also address each other as senior brothers and senior sisters, there was no close relationship. This was the difference. Not long after Wally left, Silin's communicator also received a call. "Are you in the temporary dorm?" The image that popped up on the communicator showed Guanfeng's face. He still looked as harmless and serious as ever. "Yes," Silin answered. "Alright, pack your things. Your senior brother will come and pick you up later." Guanfeng ended the call after saying this. Silin looked at the closed communicator and said goodbye to Libero and Ironhead. Then, he dragged Hui Mao back to his room to pack his things. Hui Mao leaned against the cabinet and watched Silin pack his things lazily. From time to time, he would give some instructions. "Hey, there's also this, the spoils of war I got from Dar." Silin took out a crocodile skin from under the bed and tossed it into the bag. "There's also a rhinoceros horn inside. I bit it off," Hui Mao said while pointing under the bed. Silin threw the bag away. twisted Hui Mao off the cabinet and shoved it under the bed. Clean it yourself. Hui Mao had piled some junk under the bed. There were also some carcasses of insects he had played to death but didn't eat. Throw them out if you can't eat them in the future. Don't pile them under the bed and let them mold. These insects aren't moldy, I asked them. Hui Mao said while wagging his tail under the bed. The them Hui Mao was referring to was King Kong, Bonner, and the other animals. I don't care. If you keep piling insects under the bed, I'll throw you out with these insects. Fine. Because he couldn't bear to throw away these insects, Hui Mao swept them all into his stomach. Silin couldn't help but sigh when he saw Hui Mao's appearance. This cat has grown fatter again. Silin didn't leave many things in the room. Goryo drove over in a flying car not long after he finished packing. Yo, Silin. We finally meet again. Goryo greeted Silin. Silin greeted him, bid farewell to Libero and Ironhead, and then led Hui Mao into Goryo's car. Where are we going? Silin asked. To the instructor's place. Instructor Guan is treating everyone to a meal today, so everyone can get to know your little junior brother, Goryo said. But the corner of his mouth twitched unnaturally when he said this. How many disciples does Instructor Guan have? Our instructor has a strange temper and a high bar. Not many. Counting you and me, there are 2 more, a senior brother and a senior sister. The senior brother is Pastura, and the senior sister is Fu Qingqing. However, Goryo paused for a moment before continuing. The 3 of us aren't allowed to use the Purgatory Thunder Snake K. Even if the senior brother and sister think that they are capable of using it, our instructor still hasn't given them permission to use it. Therefore, you are the only one allowed to use it among us. It's inevitable that the senior brother and sister will have different opinions about it. Goryo was reminding Silin that the senior brother and sister he hadn't met yet would have a problem with him, and conflict was inevitable. But Silin wasn't afraid. What's there to be afraid of? Let's fight them back. Hui Mao said while crouching on Silin's shoulder. Goryo didn't interrupt. He had done his research on this cat. He wasn't confident that he could deal with a cat that could bully panthers so much that he wanted to crawl into the ground and make the domineering giant crocodile doll cry. That being said, Goryo couldn't help but wonder if that old fox Guanfeng had forcefully snatched Silin away from Griffin because Silin had this cat with him. It was a 2-for-1 deal. Goryo drove his flying car to a relatively empty area where a relatively large spaceplane was parked. The spaceplane's hatch opened when it saw Goryo's flying car, and Goryo immediately flew inside. This is Guanfeng's personal spaceplane, but he doesn't have just one. If you want to go somewhere during the holidays, just ask him for one. He won't refuse. Goryo led Silin into the spaceplane's cockpit. Guanfeng's personal spaceplane took Silin from this AF-1 preparatory campus planet to the bigger planet where the main campus was located. The 3 affiliated schools each occupied a planet, but most of the time, AF-1 and AF-2 students preferred to ignore AF-3. It was because AF-1 was the only school that had the right to compete with AF-2. AF-1 and AF-2 were the top schools in the Mist Bodhisattva Empire. There were geniuses everywhere, and geniuses always liked to compete with each other. That was why AF-1 and AF-2 constantly competed with each other in the open and in the shadows. On the other hand, AF-3 students were very calm. They didn't complain even if they were often ignored. In fact, they were actually very happy. At the very least, being ignored was better than being targeted. Nothing good would come out of being targeted by AF-1 and AF-2. That was why AF-1 and AF-2 students often referred to each other as neighbors instead of AF-1 and AF-2. AF-2 students especially. Why did they have to be called AF-2? It sounded like they were far inferior to AF-1 students. In reality, AF-1 and AF-2 students received 90% of the same curriculum. Sometimes, the elective classes were taught at the same time. However, the most important thing was the assignments given to them by their instructors. According to Goryo, life in an affiliated school wasn't as simple as it was in other schools. The assignments you received from your instructors might be to kill someone or do something highly dangerous. But you don't have to worry too much. Instructor Guan may be extreme sometimes, but he's very reliable when it comes to assignments. He also pays you well, Goryeo explained. The students of AF1 and AF2 did not have to pay tuition fees. Instead, they would receive some living expenses from the school. Basically, the students of AF1 and AF2 got their money from two different sources. One was provided by the school, and the other was provided by their tutors. Different instructors would receive different amounts of money. Some would receive more, some less. Of course, it was also related to the person assigned to the school. If the assignment was done well, the instructor would be happy, and the student would receive a huge sum of money. If the assignment wasn't done well, then sorry, but the instructor wouldn't deduct the student's salary. Goryeo brought Silin to AF1 and arranged his accommodation. The seniors and juniors didn't live in the same dormitory area, and their accommodations were randomly assigned to them. It was a single apartment, but it was twice the size of a single apartment at 7 Lights. It looked pretty good. Goryeo looked at the time and said to Silin, "Let's go to Instructor Guan's." "Didn't you say you're treating us?" "Yeah." Goryeo smiled a little reluctantly. "Instructor Guan always treats us at his house, and the old man himself cooks." Chapter 247. Silin didn't know why Goryeo's expression was so awkward every time he mentioned Guanfeng's treat, but Goryeo didn't explain. He simply said, "You'll know when the time comes." It was Goryeo's first time at AF1, so he was showing Silin the way around. Normally, when he was really busy, he would have to go to 3 places: the apartment, the school building, and the training field. Therefore, he had to be familiar with these 3 places. Although we're all under Teacher Guan's tutelage, he usually doesn't spend too much time teaching us. We have to submit a summary report every once in a while about our studies and work. It's a different story if we're on a mission. Don't think that it's easy to write a summary report. Teacher Guan didn't ask for a word count, but there are still some things you need to pay attention to. On the way to Guanfeng's residence, Goryeo explained to Silin about his daily work and Guanfeng's requirements. The biggest difference between this place and 7 Lights was the freedom and standards. At AF1, the instructors wouldn't spend a lot of time teaching you what to do and what not to do. They only taught you skills, and it was up to you how much you could learn from them. The courses they chose were all taught by the people of the Royal Academy of Sciences, and the only thing that mattered was the different requirements and standards of the instructors. Everyone in the Mist Bodhisattva Empire knew that Guanfeng's standards were very high. But compared to Guanfeng's high standards, Guanfeng treated his disciples pretty well. If they needed flying cars, aircrafts, and so on, they could ask Guanfeng to pick them up directly. It would be a waste not to use them. Guanfeng wasn't stingy when it came to paying his students either. His salary was among the top 5 in both AF1 and AF2. Therefore, he didn't have to worry about his daily expenses even if he wasn't on a mission. In fact, Guanfeng didn't really control his students too much. To put it bluntly, even if his students committed murder or arson, they were fine as long as they met Guanfeng's requirements. For example, Guanfeng's minimum training target was 99%. As long as they could reach this target, Guanfeng wouldn't have any objections even if they committed murder or arson. This was also the reason why Guanfeng was so mysterious. Before Silin, the students under Guanfeng's tutelage who hadn't officially graduated from AF1 were his senior brother Pastura and senior sister Fu Qingqing. They belonged to the 2 main armies of the empire, and Goryeo belonged to the wing of the 2 armies. However, Guanfeng didn't care if the 3 of them had a conflict in private. Guanfeng wouldn't care even if Silin joined the rebel army in the future. Teachers like Guanfeng had their own residential area outside the 3 affiliated schools. Goryeo brought Silin to Guanfeng's residence. Guanfeng's house had a classical style to it. There was a small courtyard outside that was filled with flowers and plants. It looked pretty cozy. However, the 2 people sitting in the living room made the cozy house feel a few degrees colder after they entered. There were 2 people sitting on the sofa in the living room, senior brother Pastura and senior sister Fu Qingqing. Both of them had a stern look on their faces. Honestly speaking, they would have attracted a lot of men and women if they looked a little gentler, But not only were they wearing stern looks, they didn't look good at all. Their auras were so strong that no one dared to say anything even if they wanted to liven up the atmosphere. Pastura and Fu Qingqing turned around at the same time when they saw Silin walk in. They shot Silin a displeased look before nodding at Goryo. Then, they returned their attention to the RAS academician's recent speeches on the big screen. Goryo was obviously used to this kind of situation. He motioned for Silin not to worry and went to the kitchen to check on the situation. Goryo returned just as Silin sat down. "I just reported to Teacher Guan. He's cooking right now." And so, all 4 of Guanfeng's students sat on the long, big sofa in the living room and watched the academician's speech. The atmosphere was pretty strange. Silin felt that Pastura and Fu Qingqing were obviously hostile towards him. Or more accurately, it was resentment. Was it really like Goryo said? Guanfeng was the only one who allowed Silin to use the PTSK? Pastura and Fu Qingqing weren't the only ones who looked like Goryo's mouth had stiffened after he came in. Silin didn't say anything when he saw that none of them were planning to say anything. He simply watched the speech with them. Hui Mao obediently squatted on the sofa to show his politeness. No one objected when he jumped onto the sofa. 5 minutes later, Hui Mao was itching all over his body. His gaze subconsciously drifted towards the big fish tank on the other side of the living room. The fish in there are so fat. Hui Mao's paws itched when he saw how much they were swimming. Hui Mao glanced at Silin and moved his butt backward again and again. "Meow meow, I'm not going to keep you guys company anymore." He ran to the big fish tank like a wisp of smoke, jumped onto it and crouched at the edge of the bathtub. The 4 people on the sofa had been paying attention to Hui Mao when Hui Mao jumped into the fish tank. They didn't stop the cat from jumping onto the fish tank for different reasons. There was a unique vent above the fish tank, allowing the fragrance of flowers and grass from the courtyard outside to enter along with the wind. It smelled very comfortable. The gray cat crouched at the edge of the fish tank and watched the fish inside. It felt like it was going to sleep as it felt the warm light shining in from outside the window and basking in the gentle breeze. It closed its eyes and felt sleepy. Pop! One of the fish seemed to be a bit hostile towards the animal's appearance. It jumped out of the water and spat out a pillar of water. The hair on Hui Mao's head was wet from the water the fish spat out. Silin understood now. No wonder Goryo and the others didn't stop him. They just wanted to see Hui Mao suffer. The fish raised its head, and when the other fish saw what its companion was doing, they too jumped up and sprayed water at the gray cat. Hui Mao was drowsy and didn't notice when the first fish sprayed water, but he was much more awake now that he was sprayed. It wasn't easy for the men behind him to spray him, but there were too many of them. Hui Mao couldn't avoid being sprayed no matter how he jumped around. These fish sprayed water very quickly and moved very quickly. They were very agile. They weren't just good-looking. The wind grew a little stronger, and Weeza's warmth was taken away by the sun's rays. It flicked away the water droplets on its ears and wagged its tail. Based on Silin's understanding of Weez, he knew that it must have come up with some wicked idea again. As expected, Hui Mao found an angle in the next moment and raised his tail, ignoring the fish spraying at him. Piss against the wind. Pitter-patter-patter, Silin, Goryo, Fu Qingqing, and Pastura. Can you be any more embarrassing than this? Silin really wanted to stuff the cat into a crack in the ground. What kind of cat would pee on a tank full of fish in a situation like this? Guanfeng walked out with a plate in his hands and saw his 4 students staring at the fat cat acting like a hooligan to a tank full of fish. He had to admit that the fish had become a lot more docile after Hui Mao had peed on the fish tank. They didn't jump up and spray water anymore. Silin guessed that they were too busy vomiting. Guanfeng put down the plate and went back to the kitchen without saying anything. Silin coughed once to remind the fat cat to mind its place. Hui Mao understood Silin's meaning and shook off the water droplets on its body. Then, it ran to the dryer to dry its fur and lay down next to Silin. It licked its fur, looked at Silin, and then at the fur on its back. What it meant was, "Come on, let's stroke it." Silin thinks, this cat is getting more and more insatiable. It didn't take long for Guanfeng to bring out all the dishes on the table. Silin suddenly understood why everyone looked like they were on their way to the execution ground when he saw the dishes on the table. color, fragrance, and taste. At the very least, color and fragrance had nothing to do with each other. As for taste, Sillin could tell from Goryo and the other two's expressions that taste might not necessarily be better than color and fragrance. The four of them sat down around the table with a plate in front of them. Then, Guanfeng added a spoonful of something muddy onto each of their plates. Sillin glanced at Goryo and asked with his eyes, "What the hell is this shit green mud?" Goryo shot Sillin a look that said, "Good luck to you." Then he lowered his eyes and let Guanfeng add food onto their plates just like Pastura and Fu Qingqing. Aside from Sillin and the other three, Hui Mao's seat was also on the table. The food on his plate was exactly the same as Sillin and the other three's. Hui Mao crouched on his elevated seat and stared at the pile of food on his plate. He glanced at Sillin and the others, and when he saw that no one was eating, he resisted the urge to stick out his tongue and lick the food. When he was finally done refilling everyone's plates, Guanfeng sat down and clapped his hands. "All right, Sillin is our new member today. It's been a long time since we last met up." Goryo, Pastura, and Fu Qingqing curled their lips inwardly. "We met 30 days ago." Even the other instructors wouldn't complain if they didn't meet for a few hundred days. "All right, let's cut to the chase. Let's begin. This is the first time you've eaten my cooking, Sillin, so enjoy it. This is a nutritious meal, not something the trash you can buy outside can compare to." Guanfeng took the lead and started eating with his spoon. Goryo and the others sucked in a deep breath and started eating as well. Pastura's face was ashen as he mechanically put the spoon into his mouth. The veins on Fu Qingqing's forehead bulged, but her face remained expressionless. They had experienced what Sillin was feeling the moment he took his first spoon. It really wasn't something the junk food sold outside could compare to. At the very least, junk food could stimulate one's appetite, but these nutritious meals of love made one seriously nauseous. Sillin endured the discomfort. He had to adapt to it since Goryo and the others had gotten used to it. Then, under self-hypnosis, Sillin put the spoon into his mouth mechanically just like Pastura and the others. They screamed in their heads, "It's not that we don't want to eat, it's that our intestines are rejecting it." As for Hui Mao, he was eating with gusto. "Instructor Guanfeng, this is the best lunch I've ever had." Cough, cough, cough. Goryo, who was choking, could no longer care about the bitter gourd juice in his cup. He poured the juice into his mouth with a twisted expression. Pastura choked, and Fu Qingqing's eyes widened in disbelief. "Delicious? The best? Are you kidding me? Are you sure you're not just flattering me to cover up the mistake you made with that tank of zeal?" After confirming that Hui Mao wasn't joking, Guanfeng chuckled. "Whis really knows what's good and what's good. Unlike those four brats, they're as blind as a bat." That's right." Hui Mao nodded in agreement. "That's right. Guanfeng didn't like to talk during meals, and neither did Goryo and the others. It was because they didn't want their numb swallowing process to be interrupted." Sillin felt like he had fought a tough battle when he finally finished the meal. However, Sillin realized that Guanfeng was telling the truth through his body's absorption of the food. These nutritious meals were very beneficial to the human body. One would only realize it after eating them. Pastura and Fu Qingqing looked a lot better after the meal. They didn't look as resentful as before when they looked at Sillin. Sillin finally understood that he wasn't the main reason for their attitude earlier. Guanfeng chatted with the four of them for a while, and Pastura, Fu Qingqing, and Goryo also gave him a report on their recent training and some of the problems they ran into during their training. They wouldn't talk about their personal matters here because Guanfeng said that he wasn't going to interfere with them. He wouldn't interfere even if the Imperial Guard and the United Garrison Army started fighting each other. Sillin listened to their reporting methods and key points. He would have to report to Guanfeng like this next time. Not bad. Guanfeng wasn't stingy with his praise. "Ask them if you have any questions, Sillin. Come to me if you really can't figure them out. Goryo has told you everything you need to pay attention to, right? I won't repeat them. You should familiarize yourself with them first." Guanfeng left and went upstairs after saying this. "Where are you going, Teacher Guan?" Sillin asked after Guanfeng went upstairs. taking a nap. Goryo and Fu Qingqing were the ones who did most of the talking. Pastura was the one who said the least, and his face was still expressionless. After talking for a while, they dispersed and went their separate ways. "Don't you need to tell Teacher Guan?" Silin asked. "You'll get shot if you interrupt his afternoon nap for something like this," Goryo said confidently. Do you need to clean that up?" Silin pointed at the fish tank Hui Mao had pissed on. "No, I'll get a new one tomorrow." All right, Silin didn't ask any more questions. There was no reason for him to care if Hui Mao didn't care. He grabbed Hui Mao and boarded Goryo's flying car. Pastura and Fu Qingqing had already left, so Goryo sent Silin back to his apartment. Before he left, he said to Silin, "Don't forget to ask for a flying car from Teacher Guan. It'll be easier to move around the planet. Don't worry, Teacher Guan has plenty of them." Silin thanked him and prepared to take a good rest. But the doorbell rang not long after he laid down. Silin looked at the image displayed on the monitor and opened the door. There were 3 people standing outside the door: Zhen Xingming, Zhen Xingyao, and a slightly older man who looked somewhat similar to the first 2. He was probably Zhen Xingming's older brother, Zhen Xingchen, who had been raised as the heir to the throne since young. Compared to Zhen Xingyao's calm demeanor, Zhen Xingchen had more of the dignified air of a ruler. Even though he hadn't officially inherited the throne yet, just standing there quietly was enough to make people feel pressured. Silin wasn't surprised that they knew his apartment and his routes so quickly. They wouldn't have timed him so precisely otherwise. They were royalty after all. Silin would have suspected that the Zhen family had declined if they didn't even have this much ability. "Come in first." Celine invited the 3 of them in. There were still some Zhen family members hiding in the shadows, but they had no intention of following them in. Zhen Xingchen wouldn't let them in either. Zhen Xingchen didn't want even his most loyal subordinates to know about the Zhen family's internal affairs. Hui Mao was lying on his bed with his eyes closed. He looked like he was asleep, but the twitching of his ears every now and then showed that he knew everything that was going on in the living room. "We just moved in today, so we don't have much to entertain you with." Silin pulled out a chair and sat down in front of the trio. "If that's the case, then let's get straight to the point," Zhen Xingchen said. Zhen Xingming and Zhen Xingyao didn't interrupt too much since Zhen Xingchen was here. Zhen Xingchen paused for a moment before turning to Zhen Xingming. "You go into the room first." "Why?" Zhen Xingming was about to voice his opinion when Zhen Xingchen glared at him. He swallowed his words and murmured, "Second brother is here too, so you just kicked me out." "Xingyao, go in as well," Zhen Xingchen said. Zhen Xingyao clenched his fists tightly and narrowed his eyes at Zhen Xingming. Zhen Xingming curled his lips and walked into the bedroom. Although he was unwilling, Zhen Xingyao still followed him into the bedroom. "Do you want to talk in the study?" Silin asked. "No need." Zhen Xingchen stared at Silin carefully, but he really couldn't find any resemblance between him and a member of the Zhen family. Therefore, he moved his gaze to Silin's left thumb and said, "I want to see the Fuji tattoo on your hand." Silin took off his glove and stuck out his thumb with the leaf pattern so that Zhen Xingchen could observe it better. In truth, Silin was also puzzled. Why wasn't the ring reacting? Even in front of the future king of estimation. It wasn't as if Silin hadn't suspected that Zhenya had fallen into a trap back then, but when he thought about it, Zhenya had never complained about anything. In fact, he often expressed his longing for his hometown. Zhenya's final words to Silin didn't sound like the Zhen family harbored any ill will towards Zhenya. In fact, Zhenya only wanted to return to the Zhen family. After some thought, Silin finally decided to show the leaf pattern to Zhen Xingyao and the others. This way things could progress a little. It really is the real Fuji pattern. Zhen Xingchen showed a leaf pattern on his wrist to Silin as well. The leaf pattern on Zhen Xingchen's wrist was very similar to the one on Silin's thumb, but there were still some differences. It was as if there were no 2 leaves in the world that were exactly the same. Those who possess the Fuji pattern are all people closely related to King Fuji. For example, me, Xingming, and Xingyao because our father is King Fuji. But what about you? Or you? Silin shook his head. I promised someone that I wouldn't tell them the reason or the original owner of this Fuji pattern before the ring gives me a hint. Jen Xingchen wasn't surprised. He had already expected this. As far as I know, only my grandfather's generation had a Fuji pattern like yours, and my grandfather was that generation's King Fuji. Chapter 248. Silin didn't comment on Jen Xingchen's claim. He simply kept quiet, neither denying nor confirming it. No one could be sure of this. If Jen Xingchen's claim was true, then this matter was related to the generation before him. The only way Jen Xingchen could get to the bottom of this was to ask his grandfather, the previous King Fuji. However, his grandfather hadn't been involved in politics for many years now. He only showed up once or twice a year to ask about the younger generation. Even though Jen Xingchen was the next heir to King Fuji's throne and the one who spoke the most to him among the younger generation, this most was limited to 10 sentences. Therefore, Jen Xingchen didn't know much about the matters of that generation. This time, after Jen Xingyao and Jen Xingming told Jen Xingchen about Silin, Jen Xingchen showed up in person. He didn't alert his father or anyone else in the Jen family. Jen Xingchen didn't get much useful information from Silin since he walked through the door, but he was still very polite. However, if the Fuji tattoo on Silin's hand wasn't the same as his grandfather's, then Jen Xingchen's attitude towards Silin would have been different. If he was the same generation as Silin, he might have forced Silin to tell him more information even if Silin was Guanfeng's student. At the same time, at Guanfeng's residence. Inside the living room, Guanfeng was sitting on the sofa with a serious expression on his face. It was the complete opposite of his usual genteel and gentlemanly persona. In fact, he looked very similar to Pastura right now. There were 3 people sitting on the guest seats opposite Guanfeng, and one of them had a bullet hole in his collar. The trio exchanged glances with each other to see who would speak first. After all, it wasn't a good idea to wake up Guanfeng from his afternoon nap. Ahem! The leftmost person was probably the one with the highest position among the trio, so he was the one who spoke first. Guanfeng, we know your habits. We wouldn't have bothered you if we weren't pressed for time. Guanfeng looked at him with the same cold expression. Spit it out if you have something to say. If the students outside heard Guanfeng's words, their jaws would definitely drop to the ground. Who would have thought that Guanfeng would actually swear? You're done venting your anger. Look, you almost cut off my neck. The man in the middle said. Guanfeng raised an eyebrow. I know it's you. Why else do you think your neck is still intact? Seeing that Guanfeng was clearly losing his patience, the leftmost man finally revealed the purpose of their visit after the other 2 signaled with their eyes. Do you know about sea blue gold? The man asked. Sea blue gold was a type of alloy. It was also the main building material for deep-sea probes and submarines so far. However, the proportions of various alloys and the types of some ultra-micro elements in sea blue gold were not fixed. The relevant researchers had been doing research to upgrade the alloy formula of sea blue gold. I don't want to waste my breath, Guanfeng said expressionlessly. Although he wasn't one of the researchers, he knew a lot of things about it. All right. The man took out an electronic file and passed it to Guanfeng. He explained, this is an image and analysis table we received a while ago. The sea blue gold mentioned in it is better than the sea blue gold we're using right now. This means that the sea blue gold formula used in this probe is more advanced than the one we're using right now. Guanfeng looked at the explanation on the electronic file before turning to the trio and saying disdainfully, not even the academicians of the Rs could come up with a better formula than this? The trio felt ashamed when they heard this. Although there were very few people who specialized in sea blue gold, it was true that they couldn't come up with a better formula than this one. That being said, they were motivated when they thought of the formula. You know that the Abyss project has reached a critical stage, but we ran into a bottleneck a few days ago. If we have this upgraded sea blue gold, we'll be able to overcome it very quickly. Guanfeng tossed the electronic file back and smacked his forehead. He knew about the Abyss project. It was one of the top 10 projects of the RAS right now. A few days ago, he heard that the Abyss project had run into a problem that they couldn't solve until now. Now that they had found a way to solve it, it was no wonder that they were in such a hurry and interrupted Guanfeng's lunch break to explain it to him. However, what does this have to do with me? I'm not a member of the BIS project, Guanfeng said while crossing his legs on the sofa. The man rubbed his hands together. The person with the upgraded Sea Blue Gold formula is in the 19th star region of the Empire. We tried to contact him from afar, but the situation over there is pretty complicated. That's why we're going to send someone to talk to him face to face. We can let him enter the RAS, skip the honorary scholar title and become an academician straight away. We'll send someone to talk to him, but we'll need an escort. Guanfeng cut him off before he could finish. Get lost. My student isn't a bodyguard, and he doesn't have the time or energy to be your bodyguard. Sai, they count as bodyguards. We have the military escorting them, but it's better to take some of the RAS own people with us. We've already transferred some students from AF1 and AF2, and you, Guanfeng, are our top priority. Everyone's hoping that you'll send a student to join us. He was the vice dean of the RAS, so he couldn't fly into a rage even if he was told to get lost. There was no helping it. He'd promised those people that he would get a student from Guanfeng. Guanfeng was very popular. After all, he was famous, and every single one of his students was being fought over by all parties. Pastura, Fu Qingqing, and Goryeo had all been booked by 3 parties before they even graduated. It was obvious how popular they were. This meant that although the Abyss project team was the one who proposed this, the higher-ups of the RAS had taken the opportunity to recruit some of their students and warm up the project in advance. They had transferred some of their students from several famous teachers to cultivate their relationship with the RAS. This way, even if these students left the affiliated schools and joined other forces in the future, they would still be connected to the RAS to a certain extent. They wouldn't just be tied to their courses and education. Although the people of the RAS tended to be arrogant most of the time, they couldn't pretend to be aloof and virtuous. It was something that even the higher-ups understood. Guanfeng was without a doubt a delicious cake in everyone's eyes. He was an imperial tutor and the leader of the firearms engineering project. Every one of his students was a famous figure. Even Pastura, Fu Qingqing, and Goryeo, who were still young and inexperienced, would be known by everyone in the Empire in a few years' time. Guanfeng waved a hand. They're all busy with something. That's because I heard that you accepted a new student. The new student doesn't have any other missions, and the new course hasn't started yet. A lot of people knew about Guanfeng's new student, and they've been eyeing him ever since. No way. I haven't even warmed my hands yet, and you're already dragging me away? How can there be such a good deal in the world? The trio's eyes lit up when they heard Guanfeng's words. It wasn't a forceful rejection, which meant that there was still room for negotiation. Sillin didn't know what his new teacher had discussed with the others, and he hadn't made much progress in his conversation with Zhen Xingchen either. Both sides were holding back and not revealing too much. Zhen Xingchen moved his fingers and looked at Sillin. When will the Fuji tattoo on your finger give you a notification? I'm not sure myself. I thought it would when I saw you guys, but unfortunately, it didn't. It was why Sillin had shown up in front of them. Since that's the case, I can only go and ask Grandpa first. However, Zhen Xingchen stared straight at Sillin and said solemnly, I hope you can keep this a secret before I figure out what's going on. Of course, I understand. Zhen Xingchen looked at the time, stood up and said to Sillin, since we've finally met, let's have a meal together. Sillin couldn't refuse the future King Fuji's request, so he was about to agree when his communicator rang. After looking at the display, Sillin apologized to Zhen Xingchen and went to his study to answer the call. What's wrong? Weren't you taking an afternoon nap? Sillin asked while looking at Guanfeng's image. I was woken up by someone. Guanfeng's expression had returned to his usual one. Pack your things, I have a mission for you. I'll tell the school about your curriculum, so come to my place after you're done. I'll give you 2 hours. All right. After the call was over, Sillin walked out of his study and said to Zhen Xingchen, I'm sorry, but there's been a change of plans. I've been summoned by Teacher Guan for a mission. I won't force you to do it since it's a mission Teacher Guan gave you. Do your best. Jen Xingshan didn't mind at all. It was a good opportunity to ask his grandfather if he had any brothers or sisters back in the day while Silin was away on a mission. Jen Xingming and Jen Xingyao didn't manage to pry any useful information out of Weeza's mouth no matter how hard they tried. When Jen Xingshan called them out of the room, both of them were filled with questions, and they were hoping that Jen Xingshan would answer them. However, Jen Xingshan dragged them away without saying a word. He's going to Fox Guan's place again? Hui Mao wagged his tail. Are you sure he's not trying to avenge his fish? You're overthinking things. Silin dragged Hui Mao out of the house. He didn't have a flying car yet, so he could only take AF1's loop line train. When Silin arrived at Guanfeng's house, the man was bending over and pruning his flowering tree in the yard. He looked to be in a good mood. You're here? Guanfeng said while cutting a branch with a pair of shears. There's a document on the living room table. Take a look first. Silin came to the living room and read through the document. He had a general idea of the mission this time. Are you done? Guanfeng walked into the room and tossed another electronic file to Silin. This is the highest grade C blue gold formula the RAS is currently using. Memorize it, and once you're there, confirm the authenticity of the formula the old geezers told you. If it's really C blue gold, get them a new formula. Silin nodded and asked, what do we get out of this mission? Guanfeng could have turned down the offer if he wanted to, but he accepted it anyway. Guanfeng held up 2 fingers. C blue gold. I'll be able to develop Purgatory Thunder Snake S with these 2 items. Purgatory Thunder Snake S? Yeah, I was just imagining it before, but now it's time to give it a try. Guanfeng tossed an imperial debit card to Silin. I've paid you half of your salary in advance. The other half will be given to you along with the mission rewards. Silin swiped the debit card on a special card slot next to the communicator and stared at the amount displayed on it. Weeza's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Goryo was right. Guanfeng wasn't stingy with his students. Silin put away the card, and Guanfeng tossed a box to Silin. Inside were some emergency medicine and compressed food that couldn't be bought outside. Some of them were distributed internally, and some were made by Guanfeng himself. If he really sold them, they'd be worth a lot of money. After explaining the medicine and food to Silin, Guanfeng added, the RAS has a special signal network. You can contact me through the communicator as long as you're not in a severely disrupted area or isolated area. Understood. If there's nothing else, you can wait in the yard. A flying car will come to pick you up in a bit. Oh right, I don't really care about my students, but there's one thing I must emphasize. I'm all ears. Students of different instructors participate in every mission, so it's inevitable that there will be some friction between students. But don't embarrass me. Understood. Guanfeng's meaning was clear to Silin. To put it simply, he could fight, but he couldn't lose. After that, Guanfeng closed the door and left Silin in the yard to wait for a car. As expected, a flying car came to pick up Silin before long. It was an autopilot car, and it took Silin to a port. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.